Chapter 665. This is a crystal cluster. Princess Griffin saw Brando turn the body of the man in the grey robe over, revealing a piece of amethyst-colored skin under the cut robe. She looked up silently and saw that the cut at the neck of the body was like broken glass, the whole body was crystallized, and not a trace of blood seeped out. This is a crystal cluster. Brando stayed by the body for a while before replying. Some living creatures in magic crystals are affected by the moon of magic and distorted to form a kind of monster. This kind of monster is not common, and occasionally found in magic crystal veins and crystal forests. But it looks like a humanoid creature. Princess Griffin looked at the body quietly. And, what does this have to do with anything? Mr. Brando, do you know what happened to Yenbao? She stood outside the door, not wanting to be stained with the blood everywhere in the house, although the beast's body had already been dragged out and disposed of. The Countess told the coast guards that a demon fleeing from the war in Ampere Seal had attacked her brother, and let the soldiers see the body of the man in the grey robe. When the people present saw Akel's tragic state, they could not help but feel sorry for him. Since such cases had happened in the port of Ampere Seal recently, no one suspected anything for a while. He was human when he was alive. Brando replied without turning his head. He picked up a piece of crystal shard. But it was the crystallization disease that turned him into this. Crystallization disease. Princess Griffin raised her head slightly and looked at him with her beautiful silver eyes. When I was learning the knowledge on the scroll, I saw such a case. Some creatures living in the crystal veins gradually went crazy, and crystals grew on their bodies. They became crazy and began to attack humans. Brando stared at the crystal shard, and the flowing light cast a narrow light spot on his face. This is the earliest case of the crystallization disease, and it happened in the wilderness of the Four Territories. This sounds like demonization. Her Royal Highness frowned and replied. This is demonization. Brando nodded, but then sighed. Because of the abundance of magic in crystal veins, it is easier to cause magic corrosion. However, the crystallization was very special. No one knew why the crystal clusters existed. In theory, every species in Wonde had a continuous existence, but the history of the crystal clusters was a blank. We have done some research on them, but we still don't know what kind of background they have. Her Royal Highness naturally thought that "we" was referring to the Black Tower wizards, but in fact, Brando subconsciously used a player's pronoun. In The Amber Sword, the plot fans naturally investigated the crystal cluster, but as Brando said, all the investigation lasted until the Age of Light, and then came to an abrupt end.
Some people thought that there was a huge secret hidden in the crystal cluster, but more senior players asserted that before the official release of the history before the Age of Light, the origin of the crystal cluster could only be a mystery. However, it wasn't easy to track down the history of the Age of Light. The main source of information for the players was Buga's library, but the history of the Age of Light was beyond the reach of Buga's wizards. Where did the crystal clusters come from? Brando didn't care about this, he only cared about why they suddenly appeared in Erewhon. There were no relevant records in history at all. The history of the North seemed to be changing, and it seemed to have begun to deviate from the trajectory he knew. After listening to Brando's answer, Princess Griffin was silent for a while. But after a while, she asked again, but Dilfari also said that there is no crystal forest near Yenbao. So that's what I'm puzzled about, Brando replied. Princess Griffin frowned uneasily. She looked at Brando and asked, why do you say that? Because I found similar traces on Akel's body. Some crystals grew on the back of his neck, but no one noticed it under the bloodstains. Brando turned back and looked at her. He replied with certainty, this can also explain why this guy suddenly became so crazy. The dark magic will release the evil in his heart. This is not an isolated case. There must be a crystal disease spreading near Yenbao, and Baron Dahl may have been corrupted. The princess frowned deeper. How could this be? What do you think will happen to Yenbao? What should we do? It's definitely not a good thing, and there's no other way for the time being. We can only keep it a secret from Miss Dilfary, at least until we solve the trouble in the north. Your Royal Highness, you also know the distance between Yenbao and Ampere Seal. We can't and don't have the ability to intervene in everything in Yenbao. Brando did not choose to reveal all the uneasiness in his heart, because some things were just guesses to him. Besides, he could not explain his foresight of the future. He paused and just reminded, besides, Your Royal Highness doesn't want anything to happen to Dilfary, right? Princess Griffin sighed faintly. When I was a child, Dilfary was my best friend. She didn't treat me like other people. I always treated her like my own sister. But when it came to it, I couldn't help her at all. If something happened to the Count, she would be heartbroken. I saw Count Yenbao once when I was a child. He was a good father. Dilfary must have loved him very much. The half-elf girl's tone was a little weak. Brando knew that she was thinking of her father, Oberth VII, who loved his daughter very much. It could be said that Princess Griffin once had a happy family. But before he could think of any words to comfort the princess, the latter had already become determined. Princess Griffin took a breath and replied. We have to quickly solve the chaos in the north, Mr. Brando. Brando was slightly stunned. He probably didn't expect the princess to recover so quickly. In fact, he was not good at politics, but fortunately, this was a historical issue. He thought for a moment and said, Your Royal Highness, the key to solving the chaos in the north is not us, but the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The Holy Cathedral of Fire wants to put pressure on us through the nobles in the north, but I think the people of Cruz obviously don't want to see a war. This is just another game between the two sides. Princess Griffin narrowed her eyes slightly. She looked particularly charming, but a cold light in her narrowed eyes showed that the princess understood something in her heart. Of course, she understood this point, but what made her angry was that the Holy Cathedral of Fire was obviously playing with fire. The nobles in the north were not dogs raised by the people of Cruz. On the contrary, they were a pack of wolves. These short-sighted beasts could destroy the balance of power at any time for a little bit of benefit. The people of Cruz arrogantly thought that they could control everything, but in fact, they could not control anyone. But she had to worry about this point. Endless compromise was impossible. Brando promised her that this time, there would not be any concessions to the nobles in the north. This was actually the princess' own idea. First, she would integrate the forces in the south that were close to the royal family of Covardo, and then use the power of thunder to make the whole north bow down. But what kind of price would she have to pay to get the Holy Cathedral to support her? Those hateful people of Cruz, they clearly needed stability in Erewhon, but they still wanted more benefits. Since the war in Ampere Seal, she had been thinking of ways to limit the influence of the Holy Cathedral in Erewhon. This was actually one of Brando's ideas, but the Holy Cathedral of Fire was obviously aware of this. She did not want to give in on this. But Princess Griffin suddenly remembered something. She looked up at Brando and said, Mr. Brando, can you wait for me here for a moment? What's wrong? Brando was stunned. Help me deal with things here, the princess replied. I want Count Janelesu to investigate this matter. Yenbao is on the edge of his territory, he will definitely think of a way. This was a good idea. But Brando felt that the princess was hiding something, but before he could ask, the princess had already walked downstairs. Brando looked at the body at his feet, and helplessly checked the belongings of the man in the gray robe, including some scattered things, but did not find anything that could prove his identity. He straightened up and heard a familiar sound behind him. It should be the sound of Dilfary's wheelchair. He turned around and saw the maid pushing the countess at the door. You sent those people away. Brando put down the scattered things in his hands and looked at her sympathetically. He could not imagine how big of a blow this would be to the countess, but it would definitely leave a shadow in the future. Dilfary nodded. The coast guards were easy to send away. After all, everyone present was a noble, and there was also a princess of the kingdom. Her statement was conclusive, and the evidence was there. Plus, the demons had been active in the port of Ampere Seal recently, so no one raised any questions. After all, no one could say for sure if there was an existence similar to the crystal people among the demons. Anyway, it definitely would not be a human. I knew that Akel had a bad reputation, but I didn't expect him to be so crazy. Nia told me some things just now. It's all my fault for not protecting her well. Dilfari sighed guiltily. Brando more or less guessed something. When the female knight made the request, he actually guessed that there might be a conflict between them. However, this was someone else's family matter after all, so he could only nod awkwardly. But Mr. Brando, I know very well what Akel and Baron Dahl are like. I am very worried about my father, although Her Royal Highness said so. Dilfari asked with some concern. Obviously, she was most concerned about this issue. Although Princess Griffin had comforted her with the attitude of the Holy Cathedral, the Countess was not stupid. She thought about it and felt that Brando's guess was more likely. Otherwise, her brother would not have appeared in Ampere Seal. After all, Yenbao was still some distance away from this port. Judging from the time her brother set off, the war in Ampere Seal should not have happened yet, let alone these rumors. Brando looked at her and sighed. Dilfer, you're going to lie to me again, aren't you? Dilfari stared at Brando and whispered, Mr. Brando. Brando was embarrassed. What do you mean by I'm going to lie to you again? But when he thought about it, he really couldn't be sure if he had lied before. After all, his own background was a big lie. Moreover, when he invaded this young lady's manor, it seemed unlikely that he would have told the truth. He thought about it and replied, Dilfari, can I call you that? I actually have some analysis about your father's situation, but I don't know if you are willing to listen. Of course, the Countess nodded gently, not knowing which question she was answering. Just say it, Mr. Brando. It is very likely that something has happened to your father, Brando replied. Dilfari let out a soft cry. Brando saw her grip the armrest of the wheelchair so tightly that her hands turned white from excessive force. You want to return to the territory immediately? Brando asked. Of course, Dilfari sighed softly and replied, Mr. Brando, let me ask your family. If your father is in danger, will you not be moved? Brando shook his head, of course not, but I don't recommend you go back. Why? It's very simple. Your father's current situation is that he is imprisoned, or he has already been killed. Brando saw that Dilfari's expression was getting worse and worse, so he hurriedly continued, in the first case, once you return to the territory, your father will lose the value of his existence. And in the second case, do you think that you can avenge your father when you return to the territory in your current physical condition? It would just be an additional trophy for your uncle. After Brando finished speaking, he stared at the Countess, fearing that she would not be able to accept it and suddenly faint. However, Dilfari showed an unusual strength. After a while, she replied, if I die, can Mr. Brando avenge me? Of course, Brando shook his head again, but what's the point? If you think that revenge can solve the problem, why don't you take revenge yourself? Take revenge myself. Dilfari was slightly stunned, then became excited. Can I take revenge myself in my current state? Mr. Brando, do you have any ideas? Brando nodded. Dilfari, you are just overdrawing your life. Your current physical condition is not irreversible. Besides, the Count may not have been killed, but as long as you are alive, he will have a chance to be saved. The Countess was silent. Brando saw her take a light breath. I understand. Can you give me some time to think about it, Mr. Brando? Anytime, Brando replied, but I also want to tell you, Countess, whether you agree or not, I will not let you go back to Yenbao alone. Please believe me, I am responsible for the heroes of Ampere Seal. Mr. Brando, you. Dilfery did not know whether to laugh or cry. "Thank you, Mr. Brando. You are too much." "I have always been too much," Brando replied without blushing. It was at this time that he saw Princess Griffin coming back from outside. The princess seemed to have finished sending the message. She glanced at the two of them. Although she had heard their conversation, she did not express any opinions. Instead, she only said to Brando, "Mr. Brando, can you accompany me to meet someone?" "Meet someone, now?" Her Royal Highness nodded. Brando was stunned. He vaguely guessed that the person the princess wanted him to meet might have something to do with the situation in the north. At the moment, only this matter could move the princess's mind. Only by solving the problem in the north, whether it was Yenbao or the future of the kingdom, everything could be solved. "Who?" he asked. "Archbishop Wood." Author's note: suddenly, Caven's block exploded. "I feel like there's a million things to think about. After spending more than a day, I finally managed to sort out some ideas. I still don't know what will happen tomorrow. Caven's block is really like Ant Flow, having a few days every month. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 666. The maid, Edessa, looked out of the balcony worriedly. The sky was blue, but under the veil of clouds, there seemed to be some kind of uneasy haze in the increasingly heavy harbor. In her eyes, the red roof stretched into the distance, and the magnificent buildings depicted a unique landscape in Pasha Road district. That was the ostentatious, exquisite, and comfortable taste of nobility. But the traces left by the storm were still there, and the broken branches in the courtyard seemed to be a bad omen. "I'll get someone to clean them up. The people down there are too much," Edessa sighed and said softly. But rather than saying it to herself, it was more like a question. She stared at the back of the man on the balcony. His dark brown hair flowed like a waterfall over his red cloak. The edges of the cloak were trimmed with snow-white fur, and it hung down to the ground. "Edessa, there's no need for that. I won't notice anyway. You know that." "You don't have to be so careful," the man said, his voice as gentle as flowing water. He raised his head and took a deep breath. Do you feel it? This is the smell after the storm. The air is the cleanest at this time, as if the world is brand new. But actually, it's very dirty outside at this time of the year. There are branches broken by the wind, and tiles scraped off the roof," Edessa replied. "For ordinary people, it's dangerous to go out at this time of the year." "Hey, Edessa, if you don't tell me, I won't know. You're always like this. Is the world so worthless in your eyes?" The man could not help but laugh bitterly. Edessa saw him sigh and felt a little uneasy, but she still replied, "My task is to tell you what I see, Your Highness." The man smiled and did not answer. She suddenly saw a flock of white pigeons flying in a certain direction. It should be the square of Nusok Street. The maidservant stared blankly at the birds as they spread their wings and soared into the sky, but it was not because she suddenly wanted to be free. She turned around and looked at her master. She asked worriedly, "Your Highness, it has been many days." "Don't worry," the man replied. Edessa could hear that he was not so sure, but she knew her master's temper very well, so she did not say anything. Instead, she buried the uneasiness in her heart well. This was something she was used to. The room was silent for a while, and Edessa quietly watched the pigeons fly away. She suddenly remembered a story she had heard from the elders when she was a child. It was said that when the birds in the north migrated south, they would pass through the storm and fight against their fate day after day in the heavy rain and lightning. But was it really possible? She could not help but look at the figure. Outside the carriage, the bustling shops and shops formed a unique scenery of the port. Although the aura of war seemed to have just faded a little, the merchants had already filled Ampere's seal with prosperity and vitality. He opened the carriage door and carefully helped Amandina down from the carriage. This made Amandina a little embarrassed. As a servant, this should be her job. And not to let the lord. Next was the merchant girl. The Roman jumped from the carriage into Brando's arms. Then the merchant girl giggled, causing Brando to pinch her tender cheeks. Ah! The Roman's little eyebrows immediately raised. Brando raised his head and looked at the carriage on the other side of the square. The curtain of the carriage was slightly lifted, and the half-elf girl watched them from behind, then nodded slightly to him. Although the princess was eager to find a way to calm the chaos in the north as soon as possible, the meeting with Archbishop Wood was delayed until the next day. Ampere's seal was currently full of forces from all sides. But in the end, it was still the princess who had the upper hand, followed by the Holy Cathedral and the nobles in the north. The Holy Cathedral was supposed to be strong, but after this well-known mistake, they had to temporarily hide under the table. As the person ultimately responsible for this incident, Wood was no longer the number one person of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the port of Ampere's seal. After he left the position of Archbishop, the Holy Cathedral had already decided on a new candidate. The new Archbishop, Gladys, was not well known in the Holy Cathedral, but Brando was very familiar with this neutral party. He was a good man, and in the future, this person served as the Archbishop in the Duchy of Antiburo. He had always called for the Holy Cathedral to maintain a fair and neutral attitude. The Holy Cathedral sending this person to Ampere's seal also showed the change in the attitude of the Cruz people towards the north and south. The new Archbishop would not arrive at the port until at least the middle of the year, so Wood was still taking care of some of the daily affairs of the Archbishop. Yesterday, when the princess took him to meet Wood, the acting Archbishop, he did not expect the latter to go out of the city to appease the people of the parish. It was not until early the next morning that the Archbishop's invitation was sent to the two of them by the servants. This time, Brando brought Amandina, but the merchant lady also clamored to go. For some reason, mainly the young lady's performance in the last battle, coupled with a series of discussions on the ownership of the Titan's wreckage, and the key role of the Roman as the actual operator, the name of the young lady had long been known in the port, so it was not very shocking for Brando to bring her along. Of course, the most important thing was that Brando knew that he would never be able to defeat the shameless merchant lady. Princess Griffin, on the other hand, brought her brother along. The four carriages soon met in the central square, and at the princess's invitation, Brando and Amandina changed carriages. The three of them squeezed into the princess's carriage, which was painted with lily and crescent emblems. At first glance, Brando saw the young Prince Haruz sitting next to the princess. The historical Prince Haruz sat quietly next to his sister, just like Brando's impression of him a few years later. He was still a quiet and weak young man, or rather, a child. Both of his hands were cramped on his knees, his head was lowered, and the soft hair on his forehead almost fell to the collar on his chest. If it were not for the white shirt with the royal coat of arms and the lion-patterned sword, it would be hard to believe at first glance that this was the future king of Erewhon. Seeing her brother like this, Griffin could not help but sigh. In her opinion, Brando was bound to occupy an important position in the kingdom in the future. She originally wanted her brother to build a good relationship with the kingdom's important minister first. In fact, she even hoped that Brando could become Haruz's teacher. This was not a fantasy. With Brando's current strength, he was fully qualified to take on this position. If he still needed to be modest, then no one in Erewhon except for an old monster from the Renaissance era like Tumen could say that they were qualified to teach this prince. But Griffin also knew that with her brother's performance, it would be difficult for him to enter the eyes of this knight. After all, the status of teacher and student were complementary. In her opinion, Brando did not need a royal student to show his status, but he was not willing to teach a good-for-nothing student to discredit himself. Of course, some people might covet this position because they wanted to curry favor with the royal family. Griffin was used to such cases. Oberwe was willing to teach her swordsmanship back then, partly because the world knew that Ober the Seventh doted on his daughter. But unfortunately, not everyone was a wolf knight, and not everyone was Brando. Griffin thought of this and could only sigh faintly. But what she did not expect was that when she felt that things were a little hopeless, Brando, who was sitting quietly on the side, was very interested in the little prince. He sat next to Amandina, who did not speak for a while. Amandina was curiously opening the drawer on the side of the carriage to look for snacks. Obviously, it was not the first time she had ridden in Griffin's carriage. In short, no one in the carriage started a conversation for a while. Taking advantage of this short silence, Brando carefully looked at the future king of Erewhon sitting opposite him. To be honest, this was the first time he had seen the little prince in this life, and even in his previous life, he and the prince had only met a few times. Although he had been in contact with the upper circle of the kingdom during the last period of Erewhon's resurgence, he had never been familiar with the prince. Of course, nominally, Heartwarming should have been the king of Erewhon at that time. But because of some well-known reasons, such as the obstruction of Grand Duke Erech, the future king was afraid that he would not have a day of independence. And in fact, he himself lacked the ability. The Prince Heartwarming in Brando's memory was just like the present, introverted and timid, which was almost the most fatal weakness of the royal family, or even of the nobility. Cruz, the famous lord of the lowlands, Hodland, had a famous line in the game: nobles can be vicious, insidious, greedy, and even incompetent, but they must never lack responsibility. And Prince Heartwarming happened to be such a person. His temperament was said to be closely related to the new queen of Oberg VII. This was only a rumor, but the palace struggle had more or less made the prince timid. Although Princess Griffin was the favorite of the old king, Brando knew that in the royal family, it had always been Cypher, the queen's side, who had the upper hand. In history, Prince Heartwarming did not wake up until his sister, Princess Griffin, was murdered. But it was too late. Later, Madara invaded Erewhon for the third time, and Erewhon was destroyed. After that, Brando left this sad place. Later, there was a rumor that Eek and Yura's daughter, Elara, reorganized the Erewhon rebellion. Some people said that Prince Heartwarming did not die in the fire when the capital fell, but was rescued by Bugha the Cross, and later married Elara. But these were all rumors, and no one had seen it with their own eyes. Not to mention Brando, who was far away in Saint Tossol at that time. But history did not make Brando despise the prince. On the contrary, it only deepened his curiosity. He had read an article on the internet, by a Erewhon netizen who introduced the prince. It was said that although Prince Heartwarming was shy and introverted, he was actually very outstanding in many aspects, especially in learning magic and swordsmanship. The article even hinted that the prince might be a chosen one. Of course, this was just a one-sided story for Brando. But it did not prevent him from finding out the truth. As far as he knew, Prince Heartwarming had been learning swordsmanship under the guidance of Princess Griffin since he was a child, but it was said that it had not been effective, which also made the princess very desperate. So where did the argument in the article come from? Or was it just to attract attention? Brando looked at Prince Heartwarming's hands, which were as white and slender as a woman's. He could not help but shake his head. This was not a pair of hands that had been using swords all year round, let alone the hands of a person with outstanding swordsmanship. As everyone knew, any talent came from hard training. Even a genius swordsman like Bugha was the fruit of countless hours of training. There was no such thing as a free lunch in this world. Of course, Brando knew that his case was an exception, but he did not think that Prince Heartwarming was a transmigrator like himself. But did the little prince in history hate swordsmanship, or was he not good at swordsmanship? Which side was right? Brando sat in the carriage, but Heartwarming seemed to notice his gaze and retracted his hand in fear. What's wrong? The princess immediately realized her brother's abnormality and asked with some displeasure. The education of the royal family required their descendants to maintain a minimum appearance under any circumstances, and Heroux's behavior today was obviously a bit too much. She knew that her brother had always been introverted and afraid of strangers, but such a helpless look was too much. In particular, she did not want Heroux to leave the impression in front of Brando that everyone could be bullied. Seeing his sister become serious, Heroux was startled and stammered, "No, nothing, sister. Your Highness, the little prince is only 10 years old this year, right? At this age, it seems too early to learn magic." Brando suddenly narrowed his eyes and said, "The nobles often let their children follow some famous court wizards to learn magic and knowledge, such as the chief court wizard Fleetwood, who died in the Battle of Ampere Seal, to Princess Griffine, and Garlock to the king's eldest son's other sisters. But in fact, all Wone's magic eventually involved the extraction of the power in the sea of magic. Although the purpose was to weave the law, the dark magic would more or less affect the spellcaster, so most wizards were physically weaker. For the same reason, although most wizard apprentices began to learn related knowledge at the age of 4 or 5, they generally began to learn magic when they were adults. Or at least until the age of 13. But Brando found something interesting in Heroux. He was almost certain that this young prince had practiced black magic before. Author's note: I've written a chapter while I'm stuck, so I'm feeling better now, sob sob. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 667. When the carriage's wheels rolled over the gap between the stone slabs, the carriage vibrated slightly and made a continuous rutting sound. The carriage shook slightly, but it was quiet for a moment. Princess Griffine seemed to understand Brando's question. Her silver-gray eyes showed a trace of doubt. Magic? Mr. Brando, Heroux hasn't started to practice magic yet. I intend to let him mature before I consider it. Besides, Heroux is a member of the royal family. In fact, I don't intend to let him get too close to the wizards. This was a tradition in the world of Wonde. Nobles often let their children practice magic, but there were few similar situations in the royal family. Magic was related to mysterious and unknown forces, and as the heir to the throne, it was necessary to stay away from unpredictable dangers as much as possible. Even in those great noble families, the eldest son was rarely born as a wizard. Even for Princess Griffine, Fleetwood was only her teacher in occultism, wizard etiquette, and history. Is that so? Brando stared at the magic triangle between Heroux's thumb and index finger. The sides of the magic triangle were smooth and almost transparent. This was a sign that there was at least one magic reaction, but it did not form a stable law like the first time he put on the Ring of the Wind. In Brando's memory, there was only one kind of spell that could cause such a change, and that was black magic. Is there a problem, Mr. Brando? Princess Griffine frowned and glanced at her brother. Heroux lowered his head in fear and put his hands between his knees. But Brando said flatly, "No, I just feel that His Highness' hands are more like a wizard's than a swordsman's. Most nobles have already started to practice swordsmanship when they are his age, right?" As he spoke, he saw His Highness Heroux look up at him in surprise. Brando saw that Princess Griffine was not paying attention, so he winked at the young prince. The latter quickly lowered his head, as if afraid of being noticed by his sister. The princess did not notice this, and she felt a little embarrassed. Heroux had indeed started practicing swordsmanship at a very early age. The problem was, how could she say that her brother was a good-for-nothing who lacked the courage to even hold a sword, let alone practice swordsmanship? Heroux, because after leaving the capital, I haven't been able to spare much time to take care of him. In the end, she sighed and took all the responsibility on herself. Sister. Heroux said weakly. Shut up, Princess Griffine suddenly said sternly. You have your own reasons for this. You should reflect on it. Brando looked at the siblings and couldn't help but laugh. He thought that perhaps the princess had something to do with the little prince's cowardly side, because compared to the average sister, Princess Griffin was too strong. After being reprimanded by his sister, Hearse obediently lowered his head and stopped talking, like a shivering little animal curled up. But Brando asked even though he already knew the answer. There's also Lord Oberway and Lord Makarov, right? If I remember correctly, they are all famous swordsmen in the kingdom. He suddenly noticed that Roman was feeding a white cat with a biscuit. The white cat was sitting on her lap, and he did not even notice when it appeared. He only saw it with its head held high, and its golden eyes narrowed as it looked at him. Amandina noticed her lord's gaze, and she turned her head and curiously reached out to stroke the cat's head. Brando saw the cat squinting its eyes comfortably, and only then did he turn his head back. The princess obviously also noticed this scene, but she did not realize the purpose of Brando's question. Instead, she replied, "They have all taught Hearse before, but Hearse's talent in swordsmanship." The half-elf girl showed a disappointed expression, but also a little helpless. Since a long time ago, the nobles had to lead their people into battle to defend against the invasion of monsters. The strength of the nobles themselves meant that they did not have the ability to protect those who relied on them. Although with the further expansion of the borders of civilization, the era of peace began to extend, and the symbolic meaning of the noble swordsmanship was far greater than its practical significance. But as the heir to the throne, if he was a useless person, it would more or less affect his prestige in the eyes of his subjects. Talent in swordsmanship is only one aspect of the problem. Normal people enter the golden age of learning at the age of 12, and it is not too early to say. But for a qualified swordsman, the first thing he must have is the courage to defeat himself. Brando looked at Hearse and said slowly. He didn't know if this prince was truly gifted or not, but he knew that for this prince, the crux of the problem probably wasn't his talent at all. It was courage. Princess Griffin looked at him in surprise. Of course, the princess understood the meaning behind Brando's words. "Mr. Brando, what do you mean?" She was already a little desperate. Oberway had taught Hearse swordsmanship for a period of time. Although the Wolf Knight was patient, he could not give Hearse the courage to face his sword. Brando nodded. This was also his original idea. In his vision, a kingdom like Erewhon's would eventually move toward a political system similar to the aristocratic parliament of Cruz around the Second Era. It seemed that the princess was also aware of this. But before that, Erewhon was the king who overachieved this change. At least he did not want to see a coward who was at the mercy of others. Moreover, if the players on the forums weren't mistaken, Hearse should have become an outstanding lord. "Your Highness, do you also want me to be Prince Hearse's teacher?" He thought for a moment and asked, "But I don't have much experience, and I can't guarantee that I can teach His Highness anything." Brando was not modest, he was just giving a heads up. Before him, Oberway and Fleetwood were the teachers of the young prince. Brendel believed that he wasn't much better than the best of the best in this era except for his ability to foresee the future. In fact, he was far inferior to them. On the other hand, he really had little experience. However, he was more inclined to experiment with the little prince. The worst result would not bring any negative impact, but if it succeeded, the harvest would be too great. What's more, building a good relationship with the future king, whether it's with Hearse or Her Royal Highness, would gain a higher reputation. Brendel knew very well how much Her Royal Highness cared about her brother. Princess Griffin's idea was completely different from Brando's. The inheritance of Sword St. Darius alone was enough for Brando to become the prince's teacher. She knew that there was a huge network behind it, not to mention that Brando himself was also outstanding in swordsmanship and knowledgeable. She took a light breath, and sure enough, her impression of Brendel had deepened. She managed to suppress the surprise in her heart and immediately said to her younger brother beside her, "Hearse, quickly greet your teacher." But Hearse raised his head and looked at Brando with some fear, then turned back and said, "Sister." He was obviously still worried that Brando had exposed his secret. Princess Griffin did not expect her brother's inner world at all. She frowned like a strict mother and said, "Heroes, Mr. Brando is the descendant of Sword Saint Darius. Even Mr. Buga is not as good as him in swordsmanship, not to mention that Mr. Brando is so knowledgeable that even Master Fleetwood and Lord Garlock have praised him. As your teacher, what are you dissatisfied with?" Her tone became more and more severe, which startled Heroes. The little prince reluctantly lowered his head to Brando and whispered, "Teacher." His voice was weak and soft like a lamb, which made Brando not know whether to laugh or cry. He could clearly see that although the prince's attitude was respectful, but at this moment, not to mention himself, even a pig under the princess's coercion would obediently call her teacher. Fortunately, he was not in a hurry. Heroes was just a weak child after all. If he could not even deal with a child after 2 lifetimes, then he should go home and plant sweet potatoes. Not to mention that he still had something on the prince. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but smile and shake his head. Next, the two exchanged swords according to the etiquette of the world of Wond. Of course, this was just a ceremony. The process was that Heroes first took off his sword and handed it to Brando. Then Brando turned the sword around and gave it to the prince. In ancient times, this process symbolized the teacher giving knowledge and a sharp sword to the student, but now this ceremony had become a ceremonial form. After completing this formal ceremony, Brando had a teacher-student relationship to Prince Heroes. In fact, as a player, Brando had heard of the existence of this ceremony, but he did not know the details. Generally speaking, teachers would teach students for a certain period of observation, and the ceremony would be officially held only when they were satisfied. So of course, he did not know that Her Royal Highness was in a hurry to let Heroes carry out this ceremony because she had a little trick up her sleeve. In Wond, once the teacher-student relationship was established, it was not so easy to remove it. But fortunately, Brando did not care about this. If Princess Griffin knew that her Mr. Knight in front of her only wanted to use her brother as an experiment, she would probably stab him to death in this carriage. Unfortunately, both of them had their own little plans and did not notice the other's conspiracy for a while. The carriage soon arrived at its destination, the gate of a manor located in the Pasha Road area. Because the reconstruction of the Anderla Cathedral was far from complete, Archbishop would have been temporarily staying here for the time being. Princess Griffin and Brando both heard that this place should have belonged to House Cypher and Ampere Seal before, but neither of them were petty people and did not particularly care about it. The carriage stopped at the gate of the courtyard. Apparently, Wood had long been prepared to welcome the arrival of Her Royal Highness. Soon, a servant opened the way for them and led everyone into the courtyard. As soon as they got out of the carriage, Amandina hurriedly pulled the Roman to the front, and Her Royal Highness also took a step ahead, leaving only Brando and Prince Heroes at the back. This was actually a tradition, and Her Royal Highness understood that as a teacher, Brando must have something to say to his new student. But what she admired was that Brando's assistant was so smart and capable that she reacted one step ahead of her. The etiquette of these upper-class nobles was not well understood by the average person. Even in half of the noble families, very few people paid attention to it. Thinking of this, she could not help but look at Amandina a few more times. On the other hand, Brando did have something to say to Heroes. But as soon as he got out of the carriage, he saw Prince Heroes walking alone at least 2 or 3 meters away from him, as if he was a scourge. But the little prince still understood basic etiquette and did not dare to overstep, walking side by side with him. Brando looked at the prince walking with his head down with some amusement. Of course, he knew what the other party was afraid of, Your Highness Heroes. Heroes was startled and looked up at him. How? Teacher, Her Royal Highness still doesn't know. Brando asked. Heroes' face turned white. Teacher. Who taught you? Brando asked. He was, of course, talking about the little prince's practice of black magic. He did not mention it in front of Her Royal Highness at the time, 1, because he wanted to leave something to be used against him, and 2, because he did not want things to get out of hand. It was, of course, a matter of course in Madara for the crown prince of a country to practice black magic. But in Erewhon, a kingdom ruled by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was a big deal. Brando's first thought was a conspiracy, but he did not rule out other possibilities. First, he needed to get an answer from Heroes. But Heroes shook his head vigorously. No, no one taught me. Of course, this did not sound like the truth. However, Brando was puzzled to see that the little prince's face was red, and it did not look like he was lying. He was slightly startled, wondering if it was really as he had expected. He asked curiously, "What the hell is going on, Heroes? Now that I am your teacher, you must answer my questions truthfully. I can promise not to tell your sister." This sentence obviously had a magical effect on Heroes. The boy raised his head and glanced at Brando weakly, as if he was a little skeptical, but in the end, he mustered up the courage to ask, "Really? I keep my word, even Her Royal Highness believes me. Do you believe me?" Brando replied somewhat shamelessly. He couldn't help but want to scratch his face, feeling that he was blushing a little. But anyway, it was just coaxing a child, so he just pretended not to hear it. Heroes thought about it and nodded honestly. "Actually, I don't know why, teacher." Huh? Brando was stunned. This question was almost the same as not answering. But he heard some clues and hurriedly asked, "You don't know why, what's going on?" "I don't know if that counts as magic." "Did you secretly go to the Royal Library?" Brando immediately asked. Heroes was slightly startled, looked at him a little fearfully, and nodded. Sure enough, Brando understood and asked again, "You read the books inside?" He nodded again. "You imitated the things inside?" "Yes." He answered carefully. "How many times?" "Only once." "Please don't tell my sister, Count." Heroes hurriedly begged in a small voice. In his opinion, Brando was already close to a demon. He couldn't imagine how this Count guessed all this. He had accidentally entered one of those forbidden areas before leaving the royal city, and it was only that one time. And he thought that no one knew about it. He couldn't help but look at Brando with some fear. Brando also looked at his new student. He could already be sure that some of the things said on the forum might be true. P.S. Happy New Year, everyone. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 668. Lord Archbishop. Edessa walked through a corridor and saw the former Archbishop of Ampere-Seal holding a pair of scissors and trimming the flowers in the courtyard. The old man was wearing a long robe and had his back to her. He bent over and put his head close to the emerald leaves. He looked absorbed. It wasn't until she spoke that Wood was slightly startled and turned his head. He smiled slightly. "Edessa, you're here." Edessa bowed and asked, "Yes, Lord Officiator. May I know why you are looking for us?" Wood put away the scissors, turned around, and put a cut flower branch on the stone table in the courtyard. Edessa saw his silver-gray eyebrows stretch and said to her, "Go and call your master. Tell him that if he wants to see that person, it's today." The maid stood there in a daze, as if she hadn't reacted for a while. But after a while, there was a glimmer of surprise in her eyes. "Lord Archbishop, you don't have to thank me on behalf of your master, Edessa." Wood waved his hand. "I didn't promise you anything. He fought for this opportunity himself. But whether you can persuade Her Royal Highness and that person, I'm afraid it will ultimately depend on your own efforts. Only you will give us a chance, Lord Archbishop." "Then hurry up and get ready," Wood replied. Edessa nodded hurriedly. She bowed sincerely to the former Archbishop of Ampere-Seal and then retreated. Wood watched her leave the courtyard and disappear at the other end of the corridor. The old man sighed and picked up the scissors again, but it was at this time that the sound of rustling footsteps came from the other side of the corridor. He was slightly startled and stopped what he was doing again. The attendant led Brando and the princess through the corridor. The sunlight penetrated through the neatly trimmed walls of flowers and trees outside, leaving a zebra-like light pattern on the floor of the corridor. "Mr. Brando, please take care of Heartwarming." Her Royal Highness saw Brando and her brother coming back from behind. She glanced at the silent Heartwarming and said softly. Brando also glanced at the little prince. In fact, Heartwarming was secretly looking at him. His dark gray eyes, which were different from his sister's, were full of anxiety and some pleading. Brando couldn't help but feel a little amused. In fact, he didn't say much. He just promised to keep it a secret for the little prince. Of course, he would keep it a secret, but not this. He knew that the real secret was that the little prince of Erewhon might have some extraordinary talent, as described in the article on the forum in his previous life. Of silver, of such talent. But now was not the time to make this secret public. On one hand, he did not want Heartwarming to become arrogant because of this, and on the other hand, he wanted to protect the little crown prince of Awin. In response to the princess's question, he lightly nodded. There was a slight light in front of them. They had reached the end of the fence surrounded by holly trees. The attendant took them around the corner of the cloister, and then Brando saw the former Archbishop of Amperseel. In his eyes, Wood looked a lot thinner than he did half a month ago, but he was also much calmer. The old man seemed to have been waiting for them for a long time. When he saw them appear, he immediately smiled and said, "Princess Griffin, Mr. Brando, you two are here." Then he looked back again, "Miss Amandina, Miss Roman, His Royal Highness, everyone is well." Amandina nodded politely, and the little Roman on her side waved at the Archbishop. Only Prince Heartwarming stood a little timidly behind everyone. Princess Griffin looked at her brother and sighed. She bowed slightly to Wood. "Archbishop," Her Royal Highness raised her head and said straightforwardly, "We are here for the situation in the north." Wood was stunned, and then he reacted. The Princess of Erewhon was so straightforward and showed a posture of not caring about the cost. She obviously wanted to tell him that she did not intend to compromise on this issue. Princess Griffin's attitude was not beyond his expectations, but it was because of this that he could not help but sigh. He understood the toughness of the princess from the beginning, but the Holy Cathedral of Fire thought that victory was in their hands. They did not expect to end up in such a huge trouble. Although the Holy Cathedral had given in many times on the issue of Erewhon, today was obviously the final highlight. If the princess could solve the problem in the north in one fell swoop, then the unification and even revival of Erewhon would only be a matter of time. Cruz was not happy to see a revived Erewhon, but there was no core conflict between the two after all. Compared with the Eagle Empire, Erewhon was just a small kingdom in a corner. The same was true for Wood. Compared with Cruz, he was first and foremost a faithful believer in the way of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so he once advocated the neutral attitude of the Holy Cathedral. Although until this attitude could not be maintained, he would still support all the actions of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. It turned out that the measures taken were wrong. But the former Archbishop of Amperseel now had to consider how to repair the losses caused by these mistakes, rather than questioning the course of action of the Holy Cathedral. He thought for a moment and did not speak. Brando on the side replied, "Archbishop, Erewhon is Erewhon who believes in the doctrine of the Holy Cathedral of Fire after all. The Holy War is imminent, and presumably the Holy Cathedral does not want to see its allies fall into civil strife. If there is Erewhon, then the Holy Cathedral of Earth and Madara will not be a problem for Cruz." Wood was stunned. His gaze immediately turned to Brando. This was the fourth time he had seen this young man, and it was this young man who had brought great trouble to the Holy Cathedral of Fire. However, Wood did not have any hatred for Brando. Instead, he admired him. "You mean the Holy Cathedral of Earth and Madara?" He raised his eyebrows and asked, "Mr. Brando, I heard that you were one of the first people to escape from Butchie and experience that war. Don't you think that saying this is because of your prejudice against the Black Rose of Brahmanto?" Brando smiled in his heart. Madara's changes could not be hidden from everyone. Especially the two empires that bordered Saint Tassol and Cruz. The Holy Cathedral of Fire must have known that Madara was ready to make a move. Otherwise, how could they have reacted so quickly in the First War of the Black Rose and immediately ordered them to retreat? But the abominable thing was that the Cruz people were obviously deliberately indulging those skeletons. In their eyes, Erwin was just a more important chess piece, but it was not impossible to give him up. Judging from everything that happened in another period of history, the bottom line of the Cruz people should be that Erwin should at least keep the part north of Ampere Seal. That was why Madara could progress so smoothly in the Second War of the Black Rose. Cruz people were wishful thinking of using Madara to divert the attention of Saint Tassol. It was not until after the Third War of the Black Rose that Madara completely recovered. But at that time, everything was too late. That was why there was a long and drawn-out war. Brando could not help but recall the war in the Alkash Mountains for a moment. He shook his head, but also saw through Wood's disguise. He replied, "If it was just prejudice, I wouldn't have mentioned the Black Rose of Brahmanto. Don't tell me that Erwin has fewer enemies." He paused for a moment and said bluntly, "If Erwin blocks the way north and west of Madara, those skeletons can only look for an exit in the east." Wood immediately closed his mouth. The old man obviously understood that the young man in front of him had seen through everything, including the plan of Madara and the plan of Cruz people. He took a deep look at Brando and said, "Madara has found the Mercury Staff, and the rise of Madara is inevitable. As far as I know, their emperor has gained great prestige in this war. I'm afraid that the time to unify this ancient country is imminent. At most, in a few years, the time will be ripe for the undead to invade the north and west. And in this time, can Erwin complete the unification and have the ability to resist Madara's invasion?" He glanced at Brando and replied. Wood did not lie this time, because he knew that in front of Brando, it was just a waste of their time. But before Brando spoke, he reminded him, "Don't forget that Erwin has another war in the north. The Holy Cathedral of Earth has started the Holy Sword in advance because of the sword in your hand, Mr. Brando." Princess Griffin listened quietly. Amandina furrowed her brows as well. In fact, they had heard Brando talk about the threat of Madara, and the princess herself was aware of this, but they did not expect that time would be so tight. Especially when the half-fairy princess heard about the Mercury Staff, she could not help but take a breath and asked, "Mercury Staff? Is that rumor true? Is it really Loki's Mercury Staff?" "That's right." Wood nodded. "How is this possible? Why didn't the Holy Cathedral of Fire tell us this in advance?" Princess Griffin could not help but be a little angry. She questioned, "Isn't Erwin also a country under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Be it the royal family of Corvado or the royal family of Cypher, they have been loyal to the doctrine of the Holy Cathedral of Fire for generations because we believe that the Flame King can uphold justice and integrity. But Archbishop Wood, what do you take us for? Because the people of Cruz do not believe that Erwin can resist Madara's invasion, and they are unable to mediate with the Holy Cathedral of Earth, Saint Tassol, and Madara at the same time, so I'm afraid that they have to give up part of their interests in Erwin, so that they can divert Madara's undead to the Wind Elves, Your Highness," Brando replied. Princess Griffin stared at Archbishop Wood angrily, and Archbishop Wood was also a little embarrassed. He did not know why this young man always seemed to be able to see through their plans at a glance. He coughed and replied, "Actually, it's not exactly like that, but what Mr. Brando said is not unreasonable. The Holy Cathedral is not omnipotent, and the Cruz Empire also has many enemies. In the end, the people of Erwin still have to save themselves. If Erwin can resist Madara's invasion, we may not give up our interests here. I'm sure you can understand this. The princess took a breath, calmed down, and nodded. I understand, but now Archbishop Wood, you have seen it too. The people of Erwin have such a wish. Does the Holy Cathedral of Fire not support this? No, Wood shook his head. Your Highness, I'm sure you understand. The Holy Cathedral is also divided into many factions, and not everyone supports you. Whether you can get the support of others depends on how you plan to solve this problem. There are many deep-rooted aristocratic forces in the north of Erwin, and you can't expect them to sit still and wait for death. But the problem now is not that I expect them to sit still and wait for death, but that they want me to sit still and wait for death. Her Highness pursed her lips and replied coldly, the aristocrats in the north are ready to move, and each wants to be independent. On this issue, I will never compromise with them. If they want a war, I can only give them a war. But I want to know, whose side will the Holy Cathedral stand on? She raised her head and looked at Wood. In fact, she knew in her heart that if the Holy Cathedral did not stand on the north side, a large part of the aristocrats in the north might choose to compromise with her. But Wood shook his head. Your Highness, I can stand on your side. But this doesn't mean anything, you should understand very well. Besides, I'm not the Archbishop of Ampere Seal now. The Holy Cathedral will not give up its influence in the north. This was like a dead end. But there was always a solution to the problem. Brando looked at Wood and suddenly said, so, you have a way to solve this problem, right, Archbishop Wood? Why don't you tell me about it? Wood was slightly startled, and he looked at Brando. Brando continued, I remember you told Amandina, my assistant, that you said you might be able to solve the chaos in the north. No. Wood shook his head, Mr. Brando, it's not me, but someone else who can do it. Someone else. Brando and Princess Griffin were both startled and couldn't help but stop and look at each other. Who? Her Highness asked. She really couldn't think of anyone who could solve the chaos in the north. Was it the High Priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Or His Majesty the Emperor of the Cruz Empire? Or the Buga people? The Silver Elves? She even thought of the dragons for a moment. But Archbishop Wood said, that person also wants to see you, but before that, he needs to get your consent. For some reason, you may not want to see him. Especially you, Princess Griffin. Me? Princess Griffin pointed at herself in confusion, why? Then who is it, Archbishop Wood? Princess Griffin, Archbishop Wood asked, are you familiar with your brother? My brother. Her Highness suddenly called out softly. P.S. Today's offering. I've been a little stuck recently, and I'm not in a good state, so I won't ask for votes. I'll ask again after I've made up for last month's outburst. Touch everyone. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 669. Levin. Ornessen. Cypher, the elder brother of Princess Griffin in history. Compared to his reputation before the civil war in Erwin, after the war, the name of the eldest son of the king disappeared. Some said that he died in the chaos, some said that he was a puppet of Duke Cypher and the queen, and some said that the princess had once spared his life and let him live in seclusion in the mountains. But just like the historical truth behind these romantic folklore, the real story often made people feel that it was natural and unexpected. After Wood's introduction, Brando and Her Royal Highness waited in the front yard for about a quarter of an hour. During this time, no one spoke, and only the sound of the Archbishop pruning the branches and leaves could be heard. Because no one could figure out the intentions of the Archbishop of Ampere Seal, it did not seem wise to let a person with a sensitive identity like the eldest son of the king appear in front of everyone. Her Royal Highness may not want to see her brother, and the latter was their enemy not long ago. Would he really be willing to help them? Although it was possible, there must be some kind of condition. Brando could not guarantee that Her Royal Highness would be willing to compromise with her enemy. But after a while, he heard light footsteps coming from behind the wall of holly trees. Everyone turned around and saw a maid leading a noble youth around the wall of leaves decorated with shrubs, appearing in front of him and Her Royal Highness. Although he had never seen him before, Brando immediately realized that this might be the prince in history. The other party's attire could be said to be not gorgeous, a simple military uniform, lavender, with a long cape that hung down to the green meadow and blended into the afternoon sun. He looked like a knight with a certain amount of assets in Bragg's, Magedon, or Fort Kirkle, rather than an arrogant crown prince. The young man had a sword hanging from his waist, but it was not an exquisite shelf. It was a real cavalry sword, and the leather on the hilt was so worn that it did not seem to be a royal item. But it was not easy to judge that the owner of the sword was a master swordsman, because there was a pair of tightly closed eyes on that calm face. Long eyelashes drooped softly, as if the person was asleep or perhaps blind. His Royal Highness was very handsome, even dignified, but he was blind. A blind person obviously could not practice swordsmanship, and it was hard to imagine that he would be involved in a series of complex conspiracies, let alone become the King of Erewhon. Brando could not help but glance at Her Royal Highness beside him, and the princess looked very surprised. A trace of hesitation flashed in her eyes, but she still asked, "Brother Levin, your eyes?" Her tone was a little hesitant and surprised. "It's just a small matter, don't mind it, Griffin." Prince Levin didn't seem to mind and smiled indifferently, but after losing my eyes, I can see more widely, and people are often deceived by everything they see. He added, "Griffin, after Winter Castle, we haven't seen each other for nearly 10 years. You should be 17 years old this year, and you must be much taller and more beautiful than then. Recently, I have often heard people talk about you." His tone was very casual, as if he was really talking to his sister, not an enemy. Although, in a sense, his awkward identity today was caused by this little sister of his. Princess Griffin was silent for a moment, then said, "That's all in the past, brother. You have done a lot of wrong this time. The kingdom, father, the people, everyone will not forgive you, and everything will eventually be on the right track. I will not shirk my responsibility, but as a son, I must support my mother. Even now, she has failed, Duke Cypher has been defeated and died, and I have become a prisoner. Griffin, you must think that I am resentful, but that is not the case. I am not here today to ask for forgiveness, I hope you understand that. No matter how the situation changes, I am still a member of the royal family of Erewhon." Levin lowered his eyelids and smiled. "Then you mean?" Princess Griffin was slightly startled, and she looked at Brando with a little doubt. Brando also frowned, guessing the prince's intentions. He pondered about the historical Levin. Ornesson. What kind of person was Cypher? There were all kinds of rumors about him, but there were very few positive descriptions of the prince. At least before this, he had never known that the prince was blind, and it did not seem like he had recently lost his sight. What kind of character did such a prince have? Was he headstrong and self-opinionated, or was he a man of great talent and strategy? All the legends in history did not count. At least from the other party's current performance, the prince was obviously not a simple guy. And it was hard to say whether the other party was involved in the conspiracy between Duke Cypher and the Queen. But in any case, the other party's identity was very sensitive at this time. He was the only son of the Queen and Oberth VII, the only qualified successor of House Cypher. Presumably, the other party should also understand this. What else could the other party's purpose be other than a deal? But the key was the content of the deal. What did the prince's eldest son want? If he wanted to inherit House Cypher again, such an idea was a bit too naive. But since the prince's eldest son said that he did not expect to be forgiven, then presumably he would not make such a naive request. Brando raised his head. At this time, the maid beside Levin whispered something to the prince. He saw the prince turn his head and smile at him. Is this Mr. Brando? I have heard of your deeds. Your performance in the Battle of Ampere Seal is already worthy of being a hero. Even the late King Eric was no better. Brando glanced at Princess Griffine and saw that there was not the slightest displeasure on the half-elf girl's face. Instead, there was a look of approval. He turned his head and replied calmly, Your Royal Highness is too kind. The hero of Ampere Seal is not one person, and it's not that exaggerated. Everyone was just saving themselves. I deeply agree. It is precisely because they know how to save themselves and struggle that civilization has continued to this day. The history of mankind and other intelligent races is itself a heavy epic. The appearance of thousands of heroes is not accidental, but a necessity. Levin smiled and nodded, which made Brando inadvertently notice that the prince had long, shining dark black hair that draped over his shoulders like a waterfall. This hair color was very rare among Erewhon, with a touch of dark purple flowing between the strands. Brother. Princess Griffine interrupted this mutual flattery. This was not what she wanted to hear. Archbishop Wood said that you have a way to solve the chaos in the north. Are you going to use this to make a deal with me? The prince's eldest son stopped and then nodded seriously. Exactly. You should understand that this is impossible. Princess Griffine frowned, but her words were immediately interrupted. Prince Levin smiled slightly and said, I understand, Griffine, but you guessed wrong. I don't want to use this as a condition in exchange for anything. I want the two of you to listen carefully to my thoughts. How about it? Brother, your thoughts. The princess was slightly startled. Levin nodded, but then said to Wood, Lord Archbishop, can I be alone with the princess and Mr. Brando for a moment? Wood held the scissors in one hand and stopped. He glanced at the prince's eldest son, then nodded and put down the scissors. He said to Griffine and Brando, Your Royal Highness, I more or less know some of your brother's ideas. Although they are a bit extreme, it is still a solution. At least at this juncture, you may be able to calm down and think about it. With that, the former Archbishop of Ampere Seal gently tidied up his robe and walked out of the courtyard. The princess frowned slightly as she listened. She watched Wood leave and turn back. So, brother, what exactly do you think? She asked. Griffine, as an enemy not long ago, you must be very suspicious of my intentions, right? Levin did not answer directly, but asked. His tone sounded casual, as if he was joking with a friend. But this question sounded a little stupid. It was natural to be suspicious, not to mention enemies. Even strangers would be suspicious of each other. Brando knew that the prince was probably not a fool. He obviously had his intentions for saying this, so he just waited quietly for the following answer. The princess obviously understood this, but she still nodded. Personally, I know what you are like, and I am willing to believe you, Brother Levin. But from our standpoint, you should also understand that politics does not tolerate personal feelings and weakness. Yes, but in fact, you may be mistaken about something. There is no conflict of interest between us, and even from a certain standpoint, we should stand together. Griffine and Mr. Brando, the prince's eldest son suddenly said. The courtyard quieted down. The princess was silent. She frowned deeply and looked at the man who should be her brother in name. Brother Levin, do you think you can gain our trust by saying this? This sentence was actually Brando's idea, but he was slightly surprised that Princess Griffine used we instead of me. No, this is not a lie. The prince's eldest son smiled slightly. Griffine, you want to solve the chaos in the north, nothing more than to end the civil strife in this kingdom and eventually unify the country. Weren't you the ones who caused the division of the kingdom? Griffine replied coldly. Is that so? Levin asked rhetorically. Was Erewhon a unified and stable kingdom before House Cypher rose up? The prince's eldest son suddenly raised his head. Although he could not see, it still gave the illusion of being watched. That kind of gaze seemed to be tangible, and his gaze swept over everyone present. Griffin, you know this very well in your heart. Do you still remember what I told you before? Her Royal Highness pursed her lips. Brando saw that her slender eyebrows were almost twisted together. He knew that Griffin and her brother in name had met once in their childhood, when Grand Duke Erek forced Oberth VI to change the defense decree during the year of the astrologer. At that time, Her Royal Highness went with her father to Winter Castle, where she met her brother. However, the historical records of this experience were only a few hurried words, and it was obviously impossible to record the conversation between the two children. However, Brando knew very well that there was nothing wrong with what the prince's eldest son was saying now. Had Erewhon ever been unified? Perhaps. Since King Erek integrated the entire southern territory, Erewhon had become a unified kingdom. But since the late king left this world, the Cypher dynasty ended, the Lionheart sword was lost, and the majesty of the royal family declined day by day. Even during the Renaissance era, with the existence of Sword St. Darius and Tulman, the central government's rule over the local areas was still very weak. And after Grand Duke Erek forced Oberth VI to change the defense decree, the kingdom's unification only existed in name. Since when had Erewhon ever been unified? As the kingdom gradually fell apart, the majesty of the central royal authority was no longer able to restrain the disintegrating parts of the kingdom. And this was all that Her Royal Highness wanted to change.
Griffin, Mr. Brando, do you only want to return the kingdom to the way it was before father was still alive? The prince's eldest son continued, if that's the case, what's the point of changing the names, Cypher, Corvado? This isn't your idea, is it? Brando and Her Royal Highness fell silent at the same time, because this was their goal. The source of the discord between the northern nobles and you, and the source of Grand Duke Erek's betrayal, Griffin, stems from the understanding of your true ambitions. You want to carry out reforms like Cruz and Saint Ossol, and try to turn Erewhon into a true centralized kingdom. If you succeed one day, it will undoubtedly be a nightmare for the powerful people today. Levin replied, no one will give up their interests, so they can't support you. No. There will always be some people who support me, such as the Highland Knight, and those who still believe in the ideals of the late emperor, Princess Griffin replied. And then? Maybe you can also count those bankrupt knight and homeless people. Maybe you can succeed, Griffin. But don't forget, you don't have much time left. The prince's eldest son calmly analyzed, Erewhon's enemies don't just come from the inside. This sentence pierced Brando's heart like a sharp thorn, and he couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Yes, for Erewhon, reform might be inevitable, but at the same time, Erewhon's enemies were not only the weak nobles. Seizing every minute and second was what he had been doing all along. Her Royal Highness raised her head. Then, what can you do, brother? The prince's eldest son fell silent. After a short while, he replied softly, it's very simple, let me become the king of Erewhon, Griffin. P.S. After a long time of being stuck, I went out to play for a few days and found inspiration again. Sigh, it's really difficult. Also, meow, this time I'm not joking with you, just you wait, humph. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation.
Chapter 670. The courtyard was eerily quiet for a moment. Except for Amandina, who softly let out a short "ah," and the merchant lady who was looking around. Princess Griffin stared at her brother as if she was staring at an object, the look on her face so cold that no one dared to speak. Brando even quietly clenched the hilt of his sword under his coat with one hand, staring at the brother and sister's every move. He was a little suspicious that the eldest prince was mentally deranged because of the shock, but no matter what the situation was, he could guarantee that as long as the other party dared to have the slightest ill intention, he would dare to send the black blade of Halran Gaia into the other party's heart before that happened. As for the identity of the eldest prince, this kind of thing had no meaning in Brando's eyes. But the king's eldest son did not do anything. He stood calmly at the center of everyone's sight, his long hair hanging down naturally, his eyes closed, and there was not a trace of nervousness in his expression. It was as if he had just greeted them with an extremely ordinary greeting, "Good afternoon," and not, "Please give me the throne. Give me a reason, brother." Finally, the princess used such a voice to break the dead silence, like the sound of water dripping into the bottom of a well. But her face seemed to be covered with a layer of ice. "The reason is simple, Griffin," the eldest prince said calmly, "because you need time to unify the southern territory. South of Ampere Seal, you can find many supporters. Mr. Brando, the Count of Tonagel, may soon replace Count Randner's position. There are also Duke Anthony and Duke Vero, who are not so greedy for power. The Highland Knight will also stand on your side because of Mr. Brando. With a unified southern territory, the north will no longer be your obstacle." "Then what about you?" Princess Griffin asked. "Will you become the king of the north? You need someone to help you go back on your words without hurting the dignity of the royal family. Not only that, compared to you, the nobles in the north will accept me more easily, because House Cypher has natural leadership over them. In addition, Griffin, there is a war waiting for us in the north, and I can be your natural shield. A unified south and a war-torn north, it's clear to you who will win and who will lose, right?" Brando's heart trembled slightly. He couldn't help but raise his head, as if he wanted to re-evaluate this heroine's eldest son. Her Royal Highness was doing the same thing as her. She raised her head and asked seriously, "If this is a lie, it's too clumsy, brother. There will be a war between the North and the South, but it depends on when it happens. You and I both know very well, Griffin. Even if the North has an incomplete Black Blade Squad and a disobedient White Lion Legion, it is impossible for them to defeat the South." Levin replied calmly. Then he listened, as if to make sure that Archbishop Wood had gone far away. "Will the Holy Cathedral of Fire allow a civil war to break out in Erewhon under such circumstances?" "I won't. They hope that you can make such a compromise with the North. It would be best if Erewhon can maintain the status quo, just like what happened after the Year of the Astrologer. But, what if you have the absolute strength to sweep the North?" Before they have time to protest, the dead silence was like dust settling in the courtyard, making all other sounds lie motionless on the ground. With all due respect, Brando finally couldn't help but speak. He asked as if he had been thinking for a long time, "Your Royal Highness, although the Queen and Duke Cypher treat you as a puppet, as far as I know, you are actually involved in this game behind the scenes." Levin suddenly turned his head and looked in the direction of the voice. His sword-like eyebrows suddenly converged, and his whole person seemed to have suddenly become taller. "You are better than I thought, Mr. Brando. I am very glad that I am not your enemy. Can you tell me how you came to this conclusion? Was it a guess, or intuition?" "None of them. It was just that the predecessor planted the tree, and the successor enjoyed the shade. In the history of the previous life, there were only a few words about His Royal Highness, and no one even said clearly about his whereabouts. However, curious players were very good at making groundless accusations, and there were many articles about analyzing Levin Ornison Cypher's character and life experience. Some of them were groundless, some were guesses, and some were rumors, but as long as this information was linked to the real eldest son of the king in front of him, the conclusion was very simple. Because of ambition, an ambitious person would not be willing to just be a pawn. Brando felt that he had never been so rational for a moment, as if he had been blessed with good fortune. All the speculations he had seen about His Royal Highness in the past had become the basis for his speech at this moment. It was as if he was standing on the shoulder of a giant. He raised his head and calmly said, "Since you can find Archbishop Wood in such a desperate situation and fight for a chance of survival, how could you really be at the mercy of others?" "It's wonderful, but it's true." The eldest son sighed, "I have stopped some things, within the scope of my power. I am happy to see some of my mother's actions succeed, but I don't necessarily agree with her methods. Besides, everyone has self-interest in their hearts, and I don't think this is a sin," he replied. Her Royal Highness wanted to speak, but she suddenly stopped. She glanced at Brando and motioned for him to continue. Brando understood her trust and asked, "So what is your self-interest, and whose side are you on?" "I said, we are on the same side. I want to be the king of the North, and you need me to be your barrier in the North." The eldest son's expression was calm. But Brando carefully observed the changes in his expression, and he had an intuition that the prince had not revealed all his true feelings. He subconsciously looked to the side and happened to see Levin Ornazon's maid frown slightly. She seemed to want to say something, but the eldest son reached out and stopped her. "All this is just a bubble. You know very well your end. Is it worth it to sacrifice your life just to be the king of the North for a year or so?" "Brother." Princess Griffin finally couldn't help but speak. The eldest son laughed and replied, "Griffin, have you ever tasted the feeling of not being able to control your own fate? I swear, one day I will control my own path, even if it's just for a minute or a second. Remember what I told you during the winter hunt? Erewhon is a black forest. You said that if you were that wolf, your choice would be the same." Princess Griffin suddenly thought of the clip that had sunk into the snow and the bloodstains that stained her vision red. In the year of the astrologer, the scene of the biting cold wind blowing across the plateau was still chilling. "Even if I have to bite off my own leg, I want freedom, because the wilderness is my home," Levin replied, revealing his white teeth. "Besides, I may not necessarily fail. Although the North is full of difficulties, there is always a glimmer of hope. Looking for a chance to survive in a desperate situation is what I am best at. Griffin, if you can't beat me, I will beat you mercilessly. Like you, I will never allow Ampere Seal to be divided for long, not even for a day." His cold voice echoed in the front yard. Even the merchant girl was startled. She turned around and stared at the madman with wide eyes. The eldest son of the king did seem crazy, but at least he was an elegant madman. He bowed to his sister, and no one could find any fault with it. Her Royal Highness thought for a while with a cold expression before calling out to him, "Do you think I won't dare to kill you?" "Yes. But I won't agree to your request." And then the eldest son of the king wasn't surprised and asked with a smile. Her Royal Highness looked at him quietly. 2 carriages filed out of the manor, and many people were waiting in the courtyard to board the carriages. He didn't tell the truth. As Amandina boarded the carriage, she reminded her lord in a low voice, "At least he didn't tell the complete truth." "I know, you mean that part." As usual, Brando helped Amandina into the carriage. This action made him look different from ordinary people. Brendel ignored the strange gazes from the servants and raised his head to ask, "What's the matter?" "I don't know, but I feel that he is hiding something." Intuition. Intuition. Intuition is also a kind of experience, my lord. Amandina replied seriously. Brando thought about it and felt that it made sense. He turned around and looked at the other carriage. The emblem on the carriage was dark and almost indiscernible. He had the same doubts in his heart. His Royal Highness was definitely the calmest person he had ever met since he transmigrated. Such a person, it was unlikely that he would tell the complete truth. But the key was what he was hiding. He turned around again and pinched the tip of the Roman's nose, causing the latter to fall back with a cry. Then he boarded the carriage and greeted the young prince and the cold-faced princess before sitting down next to the Roman. Princess Griffin frowned, as if thinking about something. Brando was probably the only one present who understood her thoughts. But he did not say much, just lifted the curtain and looked out the window. Outside the window, the scenery of Ampere Seal was gradually falling into dusk. From today onwards, Levin Renessan Cypher, her brother, was no longer the crown prince of the House of Covardo. Under the joint appointment of the princess and the Holy Cathedral, he would have a legal, new title, the new head of the House of Cypher. This new Grand Duke would be appointed to prepare the North for the war with the Lion's Mane people, but in fact, he was promised to be the King of the North. Everyone would know. Although all this had not been finalized, Brando could already guess what Her Royal Highness's answer would be. It looked like a compromise from the royal party. But only a few people knew the truth. Perhaps some people would think that Her Royal Highness should be tougher, but perhaps some people would think that this was a more mature political approach. But what really puzzled Griffin was that her brother looked so confident. No one knew if they had made the wrong choice. But in Brando's opinion, the result was actually not bad. What Erwin needed was not a righteous title, but time. If he was given a little more time, he would have the ability to save the kingdom. And now, what the eldest prince gave them was exactly what he dreamed of. As long as the nobles in the north were no longer tempted, the princess would be able to free up her hands to clean up the mess in the south. More importantly, 3 years of peace. After 3 years, the enemies that Erwin could face would no longer be limited to the chickens and dogs in front of him. The king's eldest son had his own plans, and so did Brendel himself. Valhalla was the cornerstone of all of this, he was incomparably certain of this. He took one last look at the golden sunset outside the window. In that direction, there was a line of flashing seaside, as if he could see the spectacular scenery of the loop of trade winds through the golden clouds. Then he put down the curtain and stopped thinking about these things. As for what the eldest prince really wanted, such history would be left to the future to judge. At least for Brando. P.S. There is one more update.
To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheat.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation.
Chapter 671. Most of the things that happened after Princess Griffin and Brando left the Wood Mansion could be predicted. The king's eldest son's succession to the position of Duke Cypher seemed to symbolize another compromise between the royal family and the local government. Such compromises were repeated in the history of the kingdom. Since the Year of Thunder, the power of the local government had become increasingly strong, eventually forming a vicious cycle. History seemed to be repeating itself, but in any case, at least with the intervention of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the appeasement of the king's eldest son himself, the turbulence in the north calmed down for a while and became calm again. In private, it was said that the nobles were celebrating a rare victory after the Battle of Ampere Seal, and the local atmosphere was foul as if the kingdom had returned to the days before and after the Year of the Astrologer. There seemed to be signs of banditry in the local areas again, and the merchants complained, but under all this surface, changes were quietly going on in the dark. Brando understood that Her Royal Highness could not sit still and allow Prince Levin to grow in the north, even if they had a secret agreement, even if he was her brother in name. But there was no room for personal feelings in politics, not to mention that the Holy Cathedral of Fire did not want to see signs of division between the north and south of Erewhon. At least before the end of the Holy War, the people of Cruz hoped that the ancient kingdom could maintain a semblance of stability. But that was only on the surface. In addition to these reasons on the surface, there was a more direct conflict of interest that determined this. Because in the north, in addition to the fixed territory of House Cypher, there was also the territory of the royal family of Covardo itself, as well as many areas such as Yenbao and Yanalasu. For these complex spheres of influence, the princess's party was unlikely to give up. Therefore, as part of the exchange, Her Royal Highness regained control of the White Lion Legion as expected. But perhaps because the king's eldest son himself did not want to control such an army that was not loyal to him, since the reappearance of the sacred Lionheart sword, there was a loud voice within the White Lion Legion that leaned towards the princess's side. This point was slightly different from what happened in history. In another period of history, until Freya fully controlled the White Lion Legion, the White Lion Legion did not really identify with the royal faction. But this time, Old White Lion, who had lost 2 army commanders, had clearly lost his original drive. Breton, Jocko, and Enrique, who had escaped from the Battle of Ampere Seal, were ordered to head to the north to take over the new legion. The new legion commander was the eldest grandson of the lion who had died in the Battle of Ampere Seal.
However, Brando knew that this unlucky fellow would not be able to stay in this position for long. Everyone understood that there was only one person who could lead this army. It was Freya, who held the Lionheart sword. But now was not the time. Maynard also removed Freya's name from the original list. The reason was that this girl from Bucci still needed more training. This was also Brando's opinion. In the future, she might have the ability to control an army, but she was still far from it. In his opinion, the White Lion Legion would be dormant for a long time until the officers under Carglass were formed. Only then would he have the ability to establish the White Lion infantry that truly reproduced the glory of that era. That was when the goddess of war would come into play. Before that, there were more important tasks waiting for this future goddess of war to complete. But compared to these things, some major events that happened on the table attracted the attention of ordinary people more. Especially when the Silver Folk finally intervened in the investigation of the Battle of Ampere Seal. At the request of the Bugas and the Silver Elves, the Holy Cathedral of Fire had to give up control of Ampere Seal. The mastermind behind all this was naturally Brando and a certain fairy lady. A human and a fairy, pushed forward the most important event that happened between Erwin and Cruz in the Year of the Sword in the eyes of ordinary people. In the middle of the month of the new moon, from this day onwards, the port city would no longer be called autonomous, but would exist as Erwin's trading port. As soon as this news spread, it shook the entire southern part of the continent of Lond. But no matter how the news spread, there was only one truth that would never change. That was, after several centuries, this sacred port finally returned to the arms of its ancient mother. That evening, Her Royal Highness made an exception and let Brando take her to the outer wall of the port for a walk. The half-fairy princess looked at the distant edge of the forest and the bay under the golden clouds of the setting sun. She just looked quietly, without saying a word. Her gaze reached the end of the horizon, where the sun formed a golden thread. She was in the same position as her ancestor, Yak, was in 1,000 years ago. When they came down from the tower, the princess whispered a "thank you" to Brando. Her voice was so soft that it even made Brando suspect that he was hallucinating. But in any case, at least he remembered the sparkling eyes of Her Royal Highness when she looked into the distance. She must be very proud. Otherwise, those golden eyes that reflected the cloud's shadow wouldn't have hidden the excitement in them. She was not the king of Erwin, but she was the princess who loved this land the most.
Chaotic events surrounded the port, making a clamor like the waves of the sea, so much so that the various attitudes of the people over the past month had become ascribed to decorate it. And the trivial things that were interspersed with these major events became a moderating interlude. For example, the recovery of Garlock the Wanderer. When the chief mage of the kingdom, the hero of Ampere Seal, reappeared in front of the public, it caused a sensation in the city. After all, compared to the unknown Brando, Garlock's name was originally a legend in this kingdom. Ampere Seal held a day-long carnival that day, so much so that Her Royal Highness came to tease Brando and asked him if he was jealous. Brando was not jealous at all. He was more concerned about another matter, and that was, Garlock had accepted Amandina as his apprentice as he had said before. According to the words of the great mage himself, it would be a pity if such a high talent was only willing to be immortal. Brendel could not agree more with him. But compared to this, he respected Amandina's opinion more. Fortunately, Amandine was not complacent. On the contrary, she had a desire to learn magic for a long time, but after her family went bankrupt, there was no opportunity and no time. In this way, Amandine nominally became Garlock's only successor. According to Her Royal Highness, she was likely to become a future court mage. And the third widely circulated incident of the month was also related to Garlock. The incident originated from a group of young people's curiosity about the legendary story of how the great mage escaped from the battlefield, but the person involved put on the airs of a master and refused to speak, which instead aroused everyone's curiosity. Soon, an absurd rumor spread among the city. It was said that Garlock was lucky enough to escape that day because he was hiding among a pile of demon corpses. Indeed, for a court great mage, such an experience was truly embarrassing. Therefore, out of some kindness, the port quickly banned similar rumors from spreading. However, there was one time when Brando met the great mage when he was passing through the front yard of the rebuilt Anderla Cathedral, and he accidentally heard the latter muttering to himself as he walked, "Damn feces, damn feces." Time seemed to fly by quickly. At least for Brando and everyone around him, the time spent in the port of Ampere Seal seemed to flash by amidst all these events. The gentle moon was like wood shavings floating in the river, swirling through the fingertips and disappearing from people's sight. The weather began to get hotter and hotter day by day. The storm off Ampere Seal gradually subsided, and the greenery in the mountains and forests became more and more breathtaking as time passed. It was as if the people in the port had not noticed the subtle changes around them, but the mountains and forests were already in full bloom, ushering in midsummer.
The Nagas and the Silver Elves left Ampere Seal one after another, and the port seemed to have become deserted for a while. Brendel asked Naga to bring back the gratitude of the kingdom of Aween. Presumably, the Queen of Cold Dew, who had left an illustrious mark in history, would understand what he meant. Erwin needed an alliance, and so did the Nagas under the Shining Sea. But there was another thing that made Brando's teeth ache a little. As promised, the Silver Elves took away their token, the precious ginkgo leaf. This loss was probably the most painful thing for Brando in this war. If it wasn't to save the princess, he wouldn't have wasted this precious opportunity. In his previous life, a player used this thing to exchange for an entire dragon's nest, and the value of the treasures in it was enough to buy the whole of Randner Hill and rebuild it again. And Brando only used it to exchange for the nondescript title of Count of Tonagel. Although the princess tacitly agreed to his attack on Randner Hill, but then again, Erwin's power would be concentrated in the central sooner or later. In that case, his power as the actual lord would be taken back sooner or later. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that he was looking for trouble. But fortunately, the Silver Elves probably gave Medisha face and didn't give him too much trouble. On the contrary, they stood firmly on his side from the beginning, and completely drove the tentacles of the Holy Cathedral of Fire out of Ampere Seal in the shortest time possible. From this point of view, it was worth the price of the ticket. But with the departure of the Silver Elves, the officials in the port of Ampere Seal inevitably felt that everything seemed to have become easier. The key point was that the disputes that often arose because of the differences in habits between humans and Silver Elves seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Everything seemed to have come to an end after entering the hot summer months, so Brando quickly understood that there seemed to be only one thing left in this port for him to complete. The date was moving forward methodically. Just like the date marked on an accurate timetable, the expected guest arrived on time on a sunny afternoon. It was a letter with a silver feather, and written in flying letters on the cover, to Mr. Brando. The same letter was also delivered to the princess's desk. Bugha's envoy had arrived. "Brando, Brando, look at me." A light voice pierced through the forest, as happy as a child. When Brando looked up, he saw a few beams of sunlight descending from the shade of the trees, falling on the dead leaves and moss, forming picturesque spots of light. Between these jagged rocks, there was a piece of dead wood, and the merchant lady stretched out her hands and walked unsteadily on it, as if she was very proud of her balance.
Then she jumped down from the dead wood and landed in front of Brando and Amandine, showing off. How is it? Isn't it awesome? Super awesome. Brando sighed helplessly. Roman, aren't you tired? In the forest outside the port, there was a humid heat in the sultry heat, like the mist in a steamer. Everyone was sweating profusely, except for some of the more energetic guys. What annoyed him a little was that the fairy lady had told him that the Buga mages had specifically chosen a cool, cloudy day. Now it seemed that either the silver folks' understanding of cloudy days had some problems, or the artisan mages' astrologers were simply unreliable. Brando looked back. Scarlet, Freya, Carglass, and even the Countess of Yenbao had been called over. The Countess and the Princess were whispering something behind him. Carglass was with the Tonagel youths as usual. The Shire and the Nightsong Tigers mercenaries were on guard outside, and only Scarlet sat alone under a poplar tree, reading a book with a red cover, her long ponytail hanging down to the moss. In fact, Scarlet's original literacy was not much, and could only be said to be far better than the average Highlander. Of course, most Highlanders were completely illiterate. But ever since Amandina became her teacher, this Highlander girl who did not like to talk seemed to be finding some quiet pleasure in reading more and more. It was just that reading Knight's novels all day long made Brando worried that she would eventually become like the Roman. He turned back to look at our merchant lady. She was already holding his arm and sitting next to him. It finally stopped for a while, and Brendel breathed a sigh of relief. But not long after, there was a rustling sound from the bushes in front of them. Everyone looked up and saw Makarov, Oberway, and Count Audine walking out from behind the bushes. They had obviously just arrived. Makarov first saw Princess Griffin beside Dilfery, and was slightly startled. He turned to Brando and asked, "Mr. Brando, what guests are we meeting today, and why is the princess here?" In fact, they had received the news a day before. Makarov first thought of the dragons behind Brando. It was because of the golden folk behind the princess that the royal faction was more firmly tied to the princess's chariot after the war. Of course, Fleetwood's death also dispelled the misunderstanding between both sides to a certain extent. No matter what, the chief court wizard of the kingdom was still Princess Griffin's teacher. But for Makarov, the last news he received was that the female dragon called Alaz had caused a ruckus in the port one day. After simulating the scene of a fire dragon attacking the city, she disappeared without a trace. Everyone thought that the terrifying dragon girl had left, but he didn't think so. He stubbornly insisted that she was hiding behind the scenes. And the young man called Brando, who had a special relationship with the dragons, was obviously the princess's greatest support. But he didn't know that the answer to his question was actually very simple for Brando. After listening to the story of the loop of trade winds, the bad-tempered little dragon girl had already run back to Tonagel to see her Valhalla. And today, they were meeting another group of people. But before Brando could answer, the bushes were separated again. This time, it was an old man in a silver robe. When he saw Brando, he was slightly startled before a familiar smile appeared on his face. "I'm here to take a look at today's heroine on behalf of my old friend. I didn't expect to meet you again, little Brando." "Damn!" Brando almost jumped up. He thought that the people from Buga would be Tanya and Tolman. After all, they had a deeper relationship with the kingdom. But he never dreamed that it would be such a person. William Peaster. The Silver Storm, the leader of the Silver Alliance. He subconsciously turned around and saw the princess, Makarov, and Oberway looking at him with a strange expression. It was as if they were looking at a legendary monster. The meaning in their eyes was obvious. "Brando, who are you? P.S. This is the second update of the day. If you didn't see the first one, you can go back and read it. Don't miss it. 2 updates today. I'm a little short of 10,000. But it's not much, so I'm starting to make up for it. Touch everyone. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 672. The world called him the Silver Storm. He was one of the 12 leaders of the male wizards in Dorora. His name spread across the land before Erewhon was established, and his legend was even older than the songs of the bards. Even the monarchs of the mortal world would tremble in front of him, and even the 4 great temples would have no choice but to retreat in the face of this white-haired old man. He was at the peak of the Silver Mountain, and in front of his pride, even giant dragons would have to bow their heads. If there was such a person, his name would be William Pist. The image of this archmage was depicted in folk prints. In the print, he wore a silver robe with wavy edges and held the scepter of Draka, which meant ruler of the sky, in the runic language. He read the 12 rules of Bugha to the monks in the sacred palace of the Lionheart. Today, he appeared alive in front of everyone. Makarov and everyone else froze. To the nobles of Aween, the Kurlutz Empire's emperor was someone of the highest status. It could be said that he was someone who made people hold their breaths. But William Pist was an existence that only existed in storybooks and legends. In the year of Revelation, Chaos 1517, the sacred palace of light threatened the male wizards to not participate in the holy war. Although the Bughas were isolationists, the threat of mortals angered them. 3 months later, in the War of the Month of Flowing Fire, the Bughas retaliated with 3 floating cities. The folk engravings depicted the result of that battle. The Silver Storm engulfed the White Book Knights, the highest combat power of the Templar. One person killed his way into the sacred palace of the Lionheart and read the 12 articles of the Bughas to the 7th Pope, forcing Farnesane to bow his head and admit his mistake. The deterrence of that battle remained in everyone's hearts for a long time, and it lasted until today. I didn't expect it to be you, Master William. Brando stood up and smiled bitterly, as if he was the only one left who could speak. He joked, "This is really unexpected. Hasn't the Silver Candle been monitoring the movements in the wilderness south of Madara? I thought the wizards wouldn't be so free." William stopped and gave him a deep look. Then, he smiled and said, "My young friend Brando, it seems like you know a lot about the sky above Woned. My pedantic subordinates still think that mortals know little about them, so they can maintain their ridiculous sense of mystery. The Bugha mages were arrogant, and they claimed to be the overseers and controllers of Woned skies." The runic staff in William's hand was a symbol of one of the highest powers in the Silver Alliance, the mysterious staff Draka. Its fundamental meaning was the authority to rule the skies. Mortals could not touch the sky, so naturally, they would not rashly offend the people of the Silver Clan. Perhaps the dragons would have some complaints about this, but this naturally lazy race would not necessarily go to Roland's door to denounce him for a mere title. Besides, the Silver folk were not afraid of them. To mortals, you are indeed very mysterious. Brando replied with a smile, "It's just that I happen to know more about the Magus world. I've heard that the Silver Candle Society has built a fortress south of Erewhon for surveillance purposes. It's called Nyosai, right? Are you planning to make a move against Madara? You little fellow, you don't have to beat around the bush to get information out of me. The Silver folk will not intervene in mortal wars. We are monitoring other things. Besides, those skeletons may not be a problem for you." In response to Brando's probing, William was not really angry. Instead, he smiled slightly and answered directly. "The reason I'm here this time is only because you've unearthed something incredible." At the mention of the Azure Lance, Brando also quieted down. Something incredible, the Holy Lance of Heaven was indeed one of them. The Azure Knight used the artifact to shatter the heavens. The people and even the players had always thought that it was just a legend, but who would have thought that it really existed in the world? But Brando knew better than anyone else present that the leader of the Dorora mages was probably not here because he was interested in the Azure Lance itself. "Sure enough," William continued, "but I'm more concerned about the reason for its appearance. The Mercury Staff. Forget it, and the reaction you've caused. The appearance of ancient artifacts one by one on the earth has already attracted the attention of many people. Brando listened silently, because he understood that the future era of turmoil was coming. Starting from the rise of Madara, Wond would be plunged into an era of long-term war. Everything he did in the loop of trade winds was to prepare for the coming war. Many people, including the princess's followers, were quite critical of the compromise they made with the eldest prince this time, but Brando appreciated it very much. Her Royal Highness, like him, seemed to have seen the rolling clouds of war at the edge of the sky. If one only focused on the civil war in front of them, Erewhon would be completely overturned in the coming storm. This was the lesson of history, and Brando certainly would not repeat it. Ha! William seemed to have seen through Brando's thoughts and asked with some surprise, "Little fellow, do you know something?" Brando glanced at William. This was his second meeting with the silver-robed leader of the Great Mages. In his past impression, the leader of the Dorora Mages, the Silver Storm, was an image of an incomparably majestic NPC, but in his actual experience, William Pist left him with the impression of a very kind elder. Although they did not know each other before, this great mage leader had been of great help to him. The last battle with Endesha, as well as the victory in the War of Ampere Seal this time, was also thanks to the help of Buni's cloak given by the other party. Of course, Brando knew that William's feelings for his past friends and for Erewhon were part of it, but he had always been a person who returned a favor, and was not used to owing people favors. In the future, the Bugis would also be involved in the protracted war. The Slate War involved too many forces and was too complicated, and even the Silver Folk would suffer losses. Thinking of this, he raised his head and reminded. The sacred war is coming, and the earth will be plunged into the clouds of war. At the same time, the Buga mages should have observed the coming great mana tide. Master William, the rise and fall of the magic tide has affected the ups and downs of Wond's history for thousands of years, and this time will be no exception. There must be signs before the era of chaos, and I think history is already sounding the alarm to the world. When Brando mentioned the sacred war of the mortals, William did not take it seriously. The mortals and the Silver Folk were two different worlds, and except for the arrogant provocation in the year of Revelation, the sacred war between the four holy cathedrals and the holy cathedral of Earth had never affected Buga. But when the former mentioned the great mana tide, the great mage leader's brows gradually furrowed. Brando, do you think Wond will repeat the history of the War of the Holy Saints? He turned his head and asked seriously. He had also upgraded the way he addressed Brando from "little guy" to his real name, which meant that at this moment, the great mage leader at least regarded Brando as an equal to himself in a certain sense. The reason was simple. Regarding the coming magic tide itself, the astrologers of Buga had only recently realized that this magic tide was unusual. And just as Brando said, the rise and fall of the magic tide had affected the historical changes of the continent for thousands of years, and any sudden magical attack could completely change the course of Wond's history. Even William had to think carefully about this. It might not necessarily be a repeat of history, it could also be a new danger. Brando thought for a moment and described it in a somewhat euphemistic manner. William suddenly laughed. You sound like a witch from Bunasan when you say that. He suddenly saw the Roman beside Brando, and at first he was startled, then he realized something. Little guy, have you been studying astrology recently? Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry at William's joke. The old wizard probably thought that Brando was joking with him, but sometimes when you ambiguously described what would happen in the future, it really sounded like the prophecies of the witches, but if you were to say it directly, you would probably be treated as a fraud. The Dark Dragon has already died, but the chaos at the border of civilization may be a problem, William continued. Brando heard this sentence and his heart skipped a beat. It turned out that this was what the wizards of Buga were concerned about. The Silver Candle had built a sky fortress above the Sea of Eternal Darkness to monitor the border south of Erewhon. But it was a pity that they were looking in the wrong direction. Brando recalled the history after the two wars of the Black Rose. In the year of silver, the pale poem said that after 3 days and 3 nights, the eternal night would descend. The law of Tiamat would be completely changed by the magic wave. The war slate would surface on the surface of the water, the calamity of wolves would run rampant across the land, and the era of war would arrive. But he could not say any of these things, and could only hope that William's words would be enough to attract enough attention. This conversation could be said to be confusing to others, and only Princess Griffin and Amandina who knew the inside story could understand a part of it. But the prediction of the future of the continent was not something that they could understand. In fact, with Brando's identity, this knowledge itself was somewhat extraordinary. The nobles only cared about the benefits in front of them, and even Princess Griffin only cared about the rise and fall of the kingdom of Erewhon. The survival of the continent and the changes of history were not things that mortals should be concerned about. But fortunately, William did not seem to want to delve into this topic. Makarov seemed to have finally reacted. From William's words, he could tell that this famous great wizard was here for something important. But he had never heard a word or two about this important thing from any party before today. He looked at Princess Griffin with dissatisfaction. Princess Griffin seemed to be prepared for this, and calmly replied, "Oberway, Makarov, I did not ask you to come here today, and I will not hide it from you. But this is a matter of great importance, and you have to be careful. Please understand." Makarov slightly frowned when he heard this reply. "Mortal, put away your dissatisfaction. She is right. For the miracle that you are about to see, your selfishness is but a speck of dust floating on top of a gem." William suddenly glanced at them and coldly reminded them. His words immediately made everyone fall silent out of fear. The prestige of the leader of the Silver Alliance's great wizard was on full display. Brando then ordered Baba Shah and the rest to teleport everyone into the underground ruins. They passed through a long tunnel, and this time, the Spider Queen seemed to have sensed William's presence. Like an animal's instinct, it allowed these uninvited guests to walk around in its tunnel without showing its head. This made Brando very depressed. You have to understand the frustration of a player bringing along a high-level NPC to kill a boss, but the boss cunningly hides away. The group did not move quickly in the dark. Because they weren't in a state of escape like the last time, everyone was able to relax and carefully observe the surrounding scenery. The underground tunnel was filled with crisscrossing cracks. Some were man-made, while some were natural. The cracks spread in all directions, making the entire underground ruins look like a giant spider web. From this point of view, it complemented the owner of this place. Half an hour later, everyone finally arrived at the prayer room from the other day. The prayer room was still the same as that day, immersed in darkness. Even the magic circle was still intact on the ground. William Pist only glanced at the magic circle and said softly, "This is the inheritance of the witches. They really have something to do with that thing. Rumor has it that the Myernas brought it to the glacier, but in fact, the history of the witches is much earlier than the Myernas." Among everyone, probably only Brando and the demoness Tanya behind the great wizard understood this sentence, and the eyes of the white cat in the Roman's arms also flashed. The great wizard was talking about the history before the fall of Babel Fortress. This was related to which bloodline the Azure Knight had inherited. The great wizard put his hand on the teleportation circle, then frowned and retracted it. This magic circle is also a bloodline inheritance. It can almost be considered the strongest protective measure. He turned to look at Brando and asked, "But you should have prepared the countermeasures, right?" "Of course." Brando turned back. Sugar jar. P.S. 3 consecutive updates of 10,000 words, continue to make up. Continue to make up. Also, from today onwards, please call me 10,000 Strong Baboon. I have opened a Sino Weibo called Eternal Flame FF, seeking mutual fans, seeking attention. Although there is not much content, but in order to make my IQ fall below the limit, please work hard. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheat.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 673. There was a miracle in this world that could not be described with words. Every time he looked up and saw the spear bathed in interweaving lightning, he would have such a thought in his mind. The spear floated in the middle of the hole. Rolling dark clouds surrounded it, and streaks of platinum lightning shot out from the clouds, hitting the spear, and then bouncing off in an arc, dissipating into the darkness. In the dark clouds, there was no sound of thunder. Instead, in the silence, everyone saw the scene of heaven and earth collapsing, and the stars falling to the ground. The green light flowed on the floor of the hall, outlining the shadows of every protruding stone. The light changed like flowing water, as if there was a quiet river flowing under the ground. Facing such a scene, even William could not help but change his expression. Makarov and Oberway were even more dumbfounded when they entered the hall. With a clatter, the small staff in Tanya's hand fell to the ground, and the former did not even notice. The Roman looked up, her eyes wide open, and did not care about her image. Freya beside her was also shocked, and the Knight of the Lake was behind her, staring at the spear without saying a word. Maynard, on the other hand, was mesmerized. "This is the Azure Spear," Brando heard the female knight muttering behind him, and could not help but look back at her strangely. Because this reaction was almost the same as his that day, but he did not think too much about it, and just waited for William to finish admiring it. After all, other than these Bugit craftsmen mages with extensive knowledge, no one on this continent would dare to say that they were qualified to confirm that this was the real Azure Spear. The wait was not long. Just a few minutes later, Brando heard William let out a heavy sigh. The old mage seemed to sigh, and then said, "This is the real Azure Spear." There was dead silence. Makarov's reaction was a bit like a mechanical puppet that the Hazel people had sealed underground for many years. He turned his head stiffly, and stuttered, "Master. You said this is—" "Shut up, I didn't ask you to interrupt." William interrupted him. Although Makarov was known as the cunning fox of the kingdom, he did not dare to act rashly in front of this big shot. He was slightly stunned, and could only force himself to shut up, but his expression was as ugly as it could be. Then the old mage nodded in satisfaction, and he looked back at Brando. "The reappearance of the Azure Spear may not be a good thing. What do you plan to do with it?" In fact, Brando had already discussed with Tanya, but he could also understand the meaning of the old mage's question. According to the Bugha's usual practice, they would completely seal this place after a certain amount of research, to avoid any trouble as much as possible. The Bugha's the people of the world were the most in this world. They Bugha's the Bugha's, and the Bugha. It wasn't just Bugha, a silver person. In fact, most of the silver people seemed to have this tendency. The silver elves also avoided the world according to a prophecy, and even the gold folk dragons sealed themselves directly in the dragon realm. Only a few young dragons would walk in the outside world. As a player, they couldn't understand the reason behind this. Some players thought that this was a setting in the game for balance. After all, for the iron folk humans and wind elves, the power of the silver folk was really unrivaled. For example, the strongest enemy Brando had ever faced was Endesha, one of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders in the loop of trade winds. She had already reached the peak of her elemental power and was close to the realm of a perfect body. But even at this level, she could only be called a little girl in front of the Silver William. Regardless of age or strength itself. And William was just one of the 12 leaders of the Wizards of Dorora. The Silver Alliance, the Great Library, the White Tower, the Rainbow Scorch, the Warlock Union, the Craftsman's Council, and the disbanded Circle 12 Magic Society. It was because of this terrifying power that the Bugha dared to claim to rule the sky and be on an equal footing with the dragons. With this kind of power, even if the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the Holy Cathedral of Wind Empress, and the Holy Cathedral of Light joined forces, or even the Holy Cathedral of Nature, all for one, and the tree herders, they might not be able to compete. If the Bugas no longer practiced isolationism, the Silver Folk and the Silver Elves would no longer ignore the world. Then the continent of Wone would not have so many kingdoms as it did today, but two major forces opposing each other. So the players thought that the way the Bugas and the Silver Elves thought might have something to do with the game's balance. But Brando didn't think so. He felt that the general silence of the Silver Folk and the Gold Folk might be due to deeper reasons. These reasons were actually only recorded in fragments in history. Brando would rather believe that something had happened in history to make the Silver Folk so cautious. Of course, he didn't have any evidence yet. It was just a guess, and he believed so based on his intuition. The reason was ridiculous, because he believed that the design team of Torrential Rain would not change the game's history just for the sake of compromising the game's gameplay. So when Brando heard William's words, he didn't answer immediately, but thought quietly for a moment. As the Great Mage said, the reappearance of the Azure Lance was not necessarily a good thing, and could be a huge problem. If he was still a player, then he would definitely get his hands on this thing at all costs. For the sake of an artifact, any player would go crazy, not to mention a legendary existence like the Azure Lance. But now he was no longer just a player. Everything that happened in this world would also affect him and the people around him. But after a short silence, Brando still replied, "Let's do as we agreed before." The old mage stared at him, as if to confirm his thoughts. Brando probably guessed what the King of Wizards was thinking, so he added, "Master William, if this is the course of history, I think it's hard for us to change anything." William sighed, "You don't understand. Forget it, let's leave it at that." "You're right, just like the 9 Phoenixes proverb, if there's trouble, there's no avoiding it." Brando was familiar with this proverb, but the background design of the 9 Phoenix originally referred to some of the cultures he was very familiar with. He nodded and replied, "Everyone I've invited here today is closely related to the Battle of Ampere Seal that day. Starting from Her Royal Highness, let everyone try one by one. Maybe someone here will become the owner of the Azure Lance, so let us witness the birth of this history." Brando, hearing his words, Princess Griffin turned her head. "I'll let you go first." "Me?" Brando was stunned. "Yes, you are my knight. In my mind, only you are the most similar to the Knight of the Azure Lance." "I hope that the Azure Lance can choose you. Her Royal Highness replied, "So I want you to try first." Brando was slightly stunned. He did not expect Her Royal Highness to have such high expectations of him. He thought for a moment, nodded to everyone, then raised his head and walked towards the Azure Lance. But before he could take 2 steps, a majestic aura had already pressed down on him. Before Brando had time to see what happened, a figure had already appeared in front of him. Only a few people present saw it clearly at that moment. The figure was clearly born from the intertwining lightning in the sky, and then appeared in front of Brando in an instant with an arc of electricity. At that moment, Brando could express his feelings with only one word: fast. The quality of a swordsman had long been ingrained in his bones. With his current strength and level of swordsmanship, almost no one could get close to him without him reacting at all. Even if it was an existence like William's, Brando could at least react before the surprise attack. However, this attack was clearly not within his expectations. Even including his experience in the game in his previous life, even with the eyes of a veteran warrior who was level 130, he had never seen such a fast attack. But he still saw it clearly. The opponent's starting posture was the classic posture of the Spear Knight in the game. But the Spear Knight would never have such terrifying dexterity. Before he could blink, the lightning spear had already pierced through his chest. Before Brando could confirm that he was injured, his whole body was already flying. At that moment, he finally saw the face of the human figure formed by lightning. But the moment he saw the face, Brando almost screamed out loud. The figure of energy under the outline of the lightning was clearly a woman. Of course, that alone was not enough to make him feel so surprised. Because the face he saw was almost exactly the same as the Roman face. Of course, the merchant miss would never raise her pair of beautiful little eyebrows high and put on such a murderous look. With this series of doubts, he fell heavily to the ground. My lord! My lord! The Shire and Medisha were the first to react, and a protective spell immediately fell on Brando out of thin air. And the Silver Elf Princess instantly held a spear in her hand, and single-handedly stood between Brando and the Lightning Girl. But the Lightning Girl stopped. She looked at Medisha and threw the spear in her hand. The lightning spear instantly turned into countless arcs of lightning and dissipated into the darkness. She coldly looked at everyone in the hall. Medisha finally saw the other party's face. "Ah, Miss Roman!" She screamed. "Ah!" As if it was a chain reaction, the Roman also stared at the Lightning Girl with a stunned expression. The Lightning Girl was slightly startled and turned her head. As if noticing her movements, Medisha raised the spear in her hand, but at this time, Brando finally caught his breath. "Don't fight with her, Medisha." Brando released his hand from his chest. The Count's coat was scorched black, but there was no trace of blood. He took a breath and replied, "She doesn't have any killing intent. She seems to be a heroic spirit that protects the spear." Heroic spirit. Medisha turned her head. "My lord, whose heroic spirit could she be? How could she look exactly like Miss Roman?" But before Brando could answer, a deep, magnetic female voice had already echoed throughout the hall. "My name is Ovina. Who are you, humans? Elves? And silver folk? What is your purpose here?" To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 674. This is the third update. It's written at the front. If you didn't notice the first two updates, please flip to the front. Ovina. Even Brando couldn't find the origin of this name no matter how hard he tried, let alone the others. Only Roman asked in a trembling voice, how did you impersonate me?" Ovina glanced at Roman and paused. "I see." "Ha! What do you mean?" The merchant girl was confused. The Lightning Girl turned around and frowned at Brando on the ground. "You seem to have inherited the authority from the Society of Truth, but you clearly have a higher authority. How strange. Let me see, it's really strange. You have the aura of Gaia's will." She turned her head and swept her gaze over all the others, pausing only for a moment on William. The great mage of the Silver Alliance frowned and didn't say a word, as if he was thinking about something. But Ovina's eyes lit up when she saw Freya, the descendant of the goddess of war's guards. "I didn't think this bloodline would still exist in this world," she said with slight admiration. Brando heard the Lightning Girl's words, of course, but he felt like he was listening to a book from heaven. He had never heard of any of the terms Ovina mentioned. Even in his past experience in the game, there was no mention of this. He frowned. "My lady, who are you?" "You are a heroic spirit. Whose will do you represent?" "Me." The Lightning Girl took a step forward and lifted her chin. "Human, according to your records, you should call me the Knight of Azure." The Knight of Azure. These three words echoed in Brando's mind. He opened his mouth but seemed to have lost the ability to speak. The others weren't any better than him, or worse. Medisha almost dropped the spear in her hand. Behind the princess, Makarov and the others kept muttering to themselves. "This is impossible, this is impossible." In front of them was the Azure Knight who had shattered the heavens, caused the stars to fall to the ground, and brought about the era of mortals. If one were to ask what was the most famous epic in the history of the Amber Sword, it would definitely be the Pale Poem. If one were to ask which part of the Pale Poem was the most widespread, it would definitely be the legend of the Azure Knight. That was the ancestor of all knight epics. Later generations had made up countless stories based on this legend. Almost all the knights' fantasies had the shadow of this legendary character. But she was actually a woman. Everyone couldn't help but find it hard to accept. Only Roman, after confirming that the other party wasn't pretending to be her, asked curiously, "But why do you look exactly like me?" Time flows like a long river. Among the billions of stars, there are always two that are so similar. This is just a coincidence, the Lightning Girl replied in a low voice. Brando felt like this lady was spouting nonsense. He asked, "Master Knight, may I ask what you meant by what you said before?" Ovina glanced at him and answered, "You heard what I said, and that's that. What I didn't say, I won't tell you. In this world, all secrets have a price." "What kind of price do I have to pay?" Brando asked with a frown. In the game, the players had been trying to solve a riddle, the final path to the power of existence. Obviously, no one had succeeded. But Brando had a feeling that the term Ovina mentioned before might have something to do with the final door. Because ever since the fall of Babel Fortress, ancient knowledge was lost to the earth. There were no more records of the power of existence. Since then, no matter if it was the gold citizens or the silver citizens, no one had ever truly opened the final door. Even the high and mighty dragon race stopped at the peak of the gold body. Brando looked at Ovina seriously, but the female knight made of lightning shook her head. "You can't afford to pay them, human. All right, tell me, what is your purpose for coming here?" Purpose? Brando came back to his senses and remembered the purpose of their trip. "Master, we accidentally found the azure lance that you once used. We hope to gain its approval." "I see." The Lightning Girl nodded. She looked up at the entire hole. "This should be the ruins of Barbard's Great Hole. You probably haven't heard of this name. So to you, what is this place? What year has it been in the outside world?" "This is now the territory of the Kingdom of Erewhon. It is the underground of a trading port, Ampere Seal." "Master Knight," Princess Griffin's voice sounded. "This is the First Era, the year 376. The Chaos Era has ended." The Lightning Girl muttered to herself. "Are there still divine citizens on the earth?" Divine citizens. Everyone looked at each other in confusion. What kind of term was that? Even to the players, there was a background that only existed in legends. Ovina looked at their expressions and understood what had happened. However, there was no sadness or joy on her face. She only replied, "I see, I understand." She looked up and replied, "You said that if you want to gain the approval of the Azure Lance, it's very simple. You just have to defeat me." "Defeat you?" Brando almost choked on his own saliva. She was the legendary ancient hero who shattered the heavens and ushered in a new era. Legend had it that the Azure Knight was a hero who lived in the era before Babel Fortress was destroyed. She almost certainly had existential power, and even in that terrifying era, her power was at the top of the line. From this, one could tell how terrifying the Lightning Girl's power was. Although he knew that it would not be easy to obtain the Azure Lance, after all, the Amber Sword was first and foremost a game, and since it was a game, there was no such thing as a free lunch. Brando did not expect the conditions of this dungeon to be so simple and yet so demanding. Defeating the Azure Knight's heroic spirit was enough. The question was that even possible? Brando could roughly estimate based on the power of the previous attack. Even if he was at his peak in the game, and with the help of the other top players in the Grecius Knight squad, he might not be able to defeat the Lightning Girl in front of him. He could not help but wonder. He asked, "My lady, may I know, how much power does your heroic spirit have when you were alive? Ovina smiled slightly. You are very smart, human. You even know to investigate your opponent's power. But I'm afraid my answer will disappoint you. As long as I am in this hall, my power is equal to my peak power. Everyone felt as if they had been punched in the face. Makarov and the others could not help but look at the legendary mage from the Silver Alliance. But William could not help but smile bitterly. Although his power was close to the peak of the mortal world, it was not enough in the face of the power of existence. He shook his head. There was no chance of winning. This is too much. Princess Griffin was stunned. She could not help but frown as she replied, My lady, how could anyone defeat you? Little half-elf girl, if you cannot defeat me, what right do you have to use my weapon? The lightning girl smiled and replied. Brando frowned. Unlike everyone else, he immediately felt that there was something wrong with this condition. A game would never set a condition that could not be completed. Her Highness asked a good question. Who could defeat the Azure Knight? Even in his era, which player would dare to claim that they could defeat the Azure Knight, let alone the people present here? Or even further back, as long as they could not control the power of existence, there was no possibility of victory. He immediately thought of something fishy. He raised his head and saw a pair of eyes looking at him. It was a pair of black eyes with a hint of light purple luster. Under the slender eyebrows, together with the beautiful black hair, it set off the heroic and vigorous face. The female knight stared at him. The meaning in her eyes was clear. But she still mouthed a warning, word trap. Brando reacted immediately. He did not have time to think about why Maynard would suddenly think of this problem. But he had already raised his head and asked Ovina, My lady knight, are you saying that as long as we are in this hall, your power will be equal to your power at the peak of your power? The lightning girl was stunned and looked at him. Brando already understood, My lady knight, as long as I defeat you, I will be recognized by the Azure Lance. Yes. Ovina nodded. That's good. Brando suddenly leaped backward and shouted at the Shire beside him, the Shire, Dragon Strike. The young wizard squire understood the moment his lord spoke. Since Ovina was undefeatable in this hall, then they would change the battlefield. He reached out to the ground and the halo of law magic gathered in his palm, dazzling. What do you think you're doing? Ovina's eyebrows, made of lightning, twitched. Then anger flooded her face. I hate opportunistic people the most. As soon as she finished speaking, her figure completely disappeared from everyone's sight. Then the Roman's scream rang out, Brando, behind you. Brando's heart went cold. Normally, in a situation like this, the first thing anyone would do would be to attack the Shire to cancel the spell in his hand. But Ovina obviously saw through his relationship with the Shire. In other words, she knew he was a planeswalker. Brando felt a chill run down his back. He didn't even have a chance to fight back. A cold hand that didn't seem to be made of lightning had already grabbed his back. Order him to stop. The lightning girl's voice was frighteningly cold. No, the Shire cast the spell. There's some kind of law here that she can't hurt anyone. Brando immediately shouted. Ovina paused. How did you know? Brando smiled proudly, because you just stabbed me with your spear, did you forget? You noticed. The lightning girl's almost platinum eyes were filled with disbelief. You're a smart guy, but you think that's enough to make me helpless. Brando saw the cold, smug smile on Ovina's face and knew something was wrong. He followed her gaze and looked over. In that direction, the beam of light from Charles's dragon strike had already left his hand and hit the ground. The hall was already extremely fragile after countless years. With just one hit, the ground cracked and looked like it was about to collapse. But at that moment, Ovina said coldly, Power of fate, history reversal. Just 8 words. And then a miracle happened. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 675. Power of Fate, History Reversal. Ovina's deep voice echoed in the hall. A strange scene appeared in front of Brando. Time and space were like a series of replays. The ground that had been pierced by the white beam of light reassembled itself. The colorful array of light flowed back. The shattered stone slabs, layers of soil, and rocks were glued back together, seamlessly returning to their original state. Dragonstrike was like a retracted platinum sword that flowed back from the ground and returned to the array of laws in the hands of the stunned the Shire. The rearranged magic flowed back and was disassembled into the most primitive magic, reversing the entire spellcasting process. This was a scene that had never been seen before. Anyone with a basic understanding of magic would understand what kind of power was contained in this scene. Tanya and William, the two outstanding wizards in the crowd, were both shocked and fascinated. Time, space, and energy were the most basic explanations of the laws of the world. This was the power of existence. There's no way to fight this, boss. The Shire screamed. You can't defeat me. The Lightning Girl declared proudly. Thousands of electric arcs appeared on her body in an instant. These electric arcs expanded in all directions, each one accurately hitting every single person in the hall. The first to bear the brunt was, of course, Brando, who was being held hostage by Ovina. He was sent flying. Dilfari, Amandina, and all the non-combat Roman females let out a scream. The expanding electric arcs formed a giant net of light in the hall. One end of the net enveloped every single person and bound them to the wall on one side of the hall. Only William's eyes flashed. He raised Draka, the scepter of the sky, with one hand. A transparent hemispherical shield appeared around his body. Hundreds of golden electric arcs flashed across the magic shield and shattered into countless electric particles like fireworks. The other one who was still standing was Brando. The moment he got up, he activated the talent of the Fool. The blood of God burned fiercely in his body, forming a barrier of willpower that was almost visible to the naked eye around his body. All the lightning disappeared before it could get close to his body. When Ovina saw this, a look of curiosity appeared in her eyes. This is Odin's aura. There are so many strange things about you. This kind of magic is completely ineffective against me. Brando's Halran Gaia was already out of its scabbard. He lifted his head to look at Ovina, who was in the middle of the lightning, and swung his sword at her. What a joke. Even if he himself came, he wouldn't be a match for me. The lightning girl snorted coldly, and in the blink of an eye, all the lightning in the underground hall disappeared into the darkness. Only one beam remained, and that was the lightning spear in her hand. It was as if Ovina had already seen through Brando's attack route. The moment the ghostly blade appeared before her, her spear had already blocked Brando's Halran Gaia with a clang. The lightning in her hands was like a substance, and she was able to change the nature of the energy at will. This kind of power had long been extinct in this era. You also know the sword skills of the dragons. Do you want me to teach you a few moves? Ovina didn't seem to care about Brando's flash strike sword art at all. She parried Brando's attack with one hand and took a step back, easily maintaining her distance from Brando. Brando actually wanted to say, sure. To be able to get the Azure Knight to teach him any skill, even in the games of his era, it would be shocking. But unfortunately, he couldn't say anything because the spear in Ovina's hand was already stabbing at him like a dragon's fang. At that moment, he was almost scared out of his wits. The lightning girl's spear split into 4, and each one was like the shadow of the moon. This was the ultimate spear skill of the Astral Knight, Silent Knight. A skill with such a literary name, of course, had to be a royal inheritance of the Wind Elves. In fact, it was also one of the secrets of the astral inheritance. But the question was, what about the prerequisite skills for this move? What about the charging time? How come they all disappeared in this woman's hands? Wasn't this a bug? The 4 spear shadows hit Brando's body in an instant. Spear technique, Silent Knight's specialty, was like endless darkness. The more he dodged, the more he would pursue. But once he hit, the follow-up attacks would disappear without a trace. But with only 4 spears, with Ovina's power level, it was more than enough for Brando to suffer. Even she herself thought that Brando would lose. She didn't expect the lightning spear to pass through a layer of shadow. An illusion. A cold light flashed through the lightning girl's platinum eyes. She saw that Brando's illusion in the air was still advancing and stabbing at her. Ha! This isn't an illusion, it's a magic doppelganger. Ovina's voice was slightly surprised. She took another step back and dodged the attack. She asked in surprise, "This really is a genius sword technique. Did you come up with it?" Brando didn't answer. The 9 luminaries sword technique instantly created 4 or 5 doppelgangers. Each doppelganger attacked once. It was as if Brando's sword technique had created multiple shadows around the lightning girl. "TSK, you think you can win like this?" The lightning girl sneered coldly. She blocked all the attacks with clanking sounds and didn't use her right hand from beginning to end. Then she held the spear horizontally and swung it like she was dancing in a circle. This opening move. Dragon Tooth Slash of Steel Scales. Brando's body reacted faster than his brain. He knelt on the ground and leaned back, allowing the lightning spear's blade to graze his chin. Dragon Tooth Slash was known as the most powerful single-target armor-piercing skill. When Ovina used it, it was even more terrifying. The sound the spear made when it sliced through the air was almost like a shriek, so much so that the very air itself seemed to tremble. But Brando knew very well that this skill had a fatal flaw in its attack range. He was very familiar with this skill, so before Ovina even made a move, he had already reacted instinctively. The lightning spear flashed past like a flickering shadow. At the same time, Brando's left hand was on the ground and his right hand was already swinging Halran Gaia at the lightning girl with the spear. This move was the simplest and most effective way to deal with a warrior using Dragon Tooth Slash. Of course, it was also the most effective counterattack that the players had come up with after thousands of battles. In the past, every time Brando used it, it was always successful. But Ovina reached out with her right hand and with a creak, she firmly grasped Brando's blade. She used 3 fingers to pinch the pitch-black back of Halran Gaia. Brando felt as if the sword in his hand had sunk into steel and couldn't move. The lightning girl smiled. "You have quick reflexes. For someone your age, you have plenty of battle experience." As she finished speaking, she raised her spear and thrust it at Brando. This thrust made Brando's vision go dark. It looked like a normal thrust, but it was clearly the rock-resonant spear of the Earth Knight. As expected, as soon as Ovina thrust her spear, the ground beneath the lightning spear trembled and cracked. Rock fragments flew up from the ground and were blown away by the shockwave. Ovina had only attacked 3 times, and each time, it was the ultimate skill of a warrior class. But in her hands, it was like an ordinary skill. She threw it out one after another as if it didn't cost any money. "This time, I've really run into a cheat." That was the only thought that flashed through Brando's mind. He watched as the spear came at his throat, but he couldn't move. The rock-resonant spear was the signature skill of the Earth Knight. Its specialty was that it used the power of spatial vibrations to lock onto the enemy's dodging range. In the game, it only showed a lack of dexterity, but in Ovina's hands, his dexterity was cut to 0. Was this something a human could do? But at that moment, there was a sudden loud boom. The ground beneath Brando's feet cracked. His entire body sank, causing the lightning spear to lose its original target. The spear brushed past his scalp. The lightning girl immediately turned her head. She looked in the direction of the great wizard William and asked coldly, "Earthquake?" William put down the sky scepter in his hand and placed the end of the scepter on the ground. He nodded politely at Ovina. "Yes, Mistress Azure Knight. You want to fight 2 against 1? No problem." Ovina turned around, no longer facing Brando. Instead, she snapped her fingers. Fate, the miracle of time. A strange scene immediately appeared in the hole. Rainbow-colored light shone through the darkness like sunlight through a prism, forming pages of colorful gaps. It was a mesmerizing sight. But Brando, who was in the middle of it all, didn't find it beautiful at all. He only felt that his scalp was in trouble. Because the flowing lights were all gaps in time, the flow of time in the hall was completely disrupted. He realized that both his and William's movements had slowed down. Brando was going crazy. Even if the Azure Knight's element was fate, how could she manipulate time and space so naturally? Since when did the talent of fate add this ability? But Ovina seemed to have seen through his confusion. She answered in a low voice, "Those broken pieces of time and experiences are also part of the memory of history. The fate of people describes the world itself. There is nothing that cannot be manipulated by the laws. Your understanding of the elements is still very shallow. Now, it's my turn to attack." The lightning girl raised her spear. Endless space seemed to gather at the tip of her spear. In a flash, it formed a singularity that was impossible to see with the naked eye. The singularity had no color. It was pitch black, with lightning flashing around its edges. Although Brando had never seen a move like this, he knew that it was no joke. Because this was the first time he had seen Ovina charge up. How did he meet such a freak? Brando didn't know what to say. He turned around and glanced at William. Their only chance of winning was to force Ovina out of the hole. Otherwise, fighting the Azure Knight would be a joke. The Archmage of the Silver Alliance seemed to have realized this as well. He nodded at him. "I'll hold her back," Brando yelled. Of course, to be honest, he had no idea if he could succeed. But at least he had noticed that all of Ovina's previous attacks were harmless. This meant that due to some kind of law, this heroic spirit who was guarding this place couldn't kill the challenger. As long as he didn't die, then anything was fine for Brando. The gathering power had already created a whirlwind in the hole. Brando raised his head and glanced at Ovina in the center of the whirlwind. He raised the Halran Gaia and, slowly, inched towards her. It wasn't that he wanted to move slowly, but Ovina's miracle of time was too freakish. Not only did it slow down time for everyone around her, but it also sped up for herself. It was much more powerful than the legendary 12-circle, time imprisonment, spell of the law-defying sorcerers. But Brando knew that he still had a chance. He still had the Flash Strike Sword Art. The Flash Strike Sword Art could ignore space and time. If he got a little closer, he would be able to attack. He raised his head and watched Ovina's every move, hoping that she would be fully focused on casting that ultimate move. Then he would be able to take advantage of the opening. Of course, he didn't expect his attack to do much damage. He only needed to disturb her a little. As one of the 12 leaders of the Drala sorcerers, William's spellcasting speed was not to be underestimated, even under the effect of time slowing down. Brando silently estimated the distance. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 676. 10 meters. 7 meters. The sandstorm had completely engulfed the entire hole. The underground hall rumbled and the entire space seemed to be attracted to one point by some kind of force. Brando narrowed his eyes and endured the sharp stones scratching his face. But in the end, he found the predetermined spot. The blade flashed slightly. In the next moment, Brando's figure disappeared from where he stood and reappeared beside Ovina. The lightning girl didn't seem to notice. She looked up in surprise, but a trace of mockery flashed through her platinum eyes. Brando observed her expression and immediately realized that something was wrong. Shallow. Before he could swing the Halran Gaia in his hand, he heard Ovina's cold comment. In the next moment, Brando felt the sword in his hand hit an indestructible wall with a clang. The wall was transparent, as if the blade of the Halran Gaia was stopped 3 feet away from the lightning girl. What is this? Brendel was horrified. He had never heard of a skill that could give the caster a layer of mana shield when it was being used. How was he supposed to survive? This is not a magic shield, human. Ovina raised the tip of her spear and pointed it at his chin. She answered calmly, because you cannot defeat me. This is your destiny, like a predetermined destiny. That is why you are hesitating. Brando immediately understood that this was also one of Ovina's elements. This was another manifestation of the power of destiny. It planted a subconscious thought in the hearts of all her enemies, making them believe that they could not defeat her. In other words, there was no magic shield around her at all. It was because he believed that he could not defeat her, so his sword stopped there. Everything was just an illusion. But this illusion was so real that it was impossible to resist. Even if Brando used all his strength, his sword would always be stopped 3 feet away from the lightning girl. It was as if he was fighting himself. This kind of power was unbelievable. Never mind, since he transmigrated to this world, even in his previous life in the game, he had never heard of such a thing. He had often heard other players speculate about how terrifying existential power was, but now it seemed that it was even more terrifying than they imagined. Understood? Ovina asked. Brando smiled bitterly. This was indeed an undefeatable power, because he saw that the girl surrounded by lightning had already begun to accumulate the last of her strength, preparing to unleash her attack. At this time, the mages from the Silver Alliance had just started chanting their spells. Brando turned around and saw William's serious expression. But it was at this moment that a figure appeared in Brando's vision behind the endless storm. A figure that he couldn't even imagine in his dreams. It was a long, flame-like ponytail. Her long hair fluttered in the wind as her master pushed forward, curling around the spear in her hand. It was just a standard pike of the White Lion Legion. It couldn't even be considered a magical weapon. But the tip of the pike reached Ovina's back in an instant. It was Scarlet. The girl of lightning acutely sensed the sneak attack from behind her. With a backhand chop, she sliced half of the pike in Scarlet's hand. She turned around and looked at Scarlet in confusion. That's strange. Such weak power. How did you escape from my lightning cage? Because I'm lightning too. The girl with the ponytail roared. Let go of the Lord. I see. Ovina had already seen the electric arcs floating around Scarlet's body. She raised her eyebrows slightly. Such pure power of lightning. You also have God's blood in you, and it's Kaisu's, but unfortunately, it's far from enough. As soon as she finished speaking, she had already sent another chop toward Scarlet's neck. The Azure Knight's heroic spirit had probably seen through Scarlet's meager power and decided to take care of her first. Careful. Brando was still beside Ovina. He now knew that attacking the heroic spirit of the Azure Knight was pointless. As long as he couldn't break through the element of fate, he wouldn't be able to chop off her neck even if she offered it to him. But if he wanted to interfere with Ovina's movements, he had many ways. Brando dodged the girl of lightning and swung Halran Gaia downwards. He roared, "Rise, power of the earth!" The power on Halran Gaia suddenly exploded. The floor of the hall seemed to be bursting with layers of cracks. The floor under Ovina's feet was about to be completely torn apart. Ovina was furious. She had no choice but to retract her chop. She pressed her hand downwards and released another time reversal. This hall was her biggest weakness. Of course she wouldn't let Brando tear it apart. But as soon as she turned around, the girl with the ponytail behind her found another opportunity to attack. She didn't care that she was less powerful than an ant in Ovina's eyes. She didn't say a word. She held the standard pike with the chopped-off head and stabbed it towards Ovina's back. "Scarlet, get out of the way!" Brando shouted helplessly. He knew that Ovina's elemental power was very special. Even he couldn't do anything to her, let alone Scarlet. If Scarlet stayed, she would only be a burden to him. But it was too late. Scarlet and Brando's relentless attacks infuriated even Ovina, who had a good temper. More importantly, the magic power that William the Great Wizard was accumulating was slowly becoming a threat. Of course, with William's power, it was impossible for him to hurt her. But if he was determined to destroy the hall, it would be a time-consuming and laborious task for her to fix. A waste of energy and time. The girl of lightning finally commented coldly. At the same time, she turned her pike and stabbed it towards Brando. Ovina was very rational. Scarlet obviously posed no threat to her. In comparison, Brando, who had Halran Gaia in his hand, was more of a problem. But as soon as she thrust her pike, she immediately realized that she had made a huge mistake. Because she immediately felt Scarlet's pike hit her squarely in the back. Ovina's eyes were filled with disbelief. How could a mortal who wasn't even at the peak of gold hit her? Where was her talent of fate? Scarlet had used all her strength to strike Ovina's back. She didn't even scratch the heroic spirit's skin. Instead, she herself was sent flying. But according to the power of the precepts, whether or not this attack caused any damage, it had completely interrupted Ovina's charging skill. With a bang, the black singularity on the Azure Knight's heroic spirit pike completely disappeared. An opportunity. Brando didn't know how Scarlet had been able to pierce through Ovina's elemental power. But at least he knew that this was a perfect opportunity. While the girl of lightning was distracted, he had already raised Halran Gaia and stabbed it down. With a loud crack, the power of the earth that had been nurtured by the sword instantly spread throughout the floor of the hall. Immediately, dense cracks appeared on the flagstones on the ground, and the earth cracked under the flagstones. The underground hall rumbled and tilted to one side, seeming as if it was about to collapse completely. What the hell? Ovina finally reacted. Even though she claimed to have the power of the Azure Knight at her peak, Brando could tell that this heroic spirit had only inherited the power of that legendary hero. But her battle experience and her ability to handle the battlefield were far inferior. Seeing that the hall was about to collapse, the girl of lightning began to panic. She opened her arms and a vast amount of elemental power instantly enveloped the entire underground hall. The entire hall collapsed and then immediately recovered. But then more cracks appeared. Ovina's forehead was covered in cold sweat. She slowly realized that she couldn't hold on any longer. Because William the Silver Storm had joined the battle. The magic of an extended earthquake spell was injected into the ground, causing the entire hall to tremble. The pillars in the hall cracked and the ground began to move. Then, a large fissure appeared and sank, sliding into the cracks beneath the ruins along with countless rocks. The girl of lightning seemed to have finally realized that defeat was inevitable. But she gritted her teeth and raised her head. She said angrily, "Don't think that you've won." The entire hall was falling apart into countless pieces. Ovina stood under the largest rock and looked down at Brando and Scarlet. She reached out her hand and retracted the elemental power that had enveloped the entire space. Then she shouted, "Destiny, the shining fountain." History unfolded behind her like a curtain. Countless heroes and legends came to life in those shining fragments and then appeared before Brando. There were some characters that Brando couldn't even name, but there were also some from the era after the Azure Knight. Among them, Brando recognized the four wise men. Mainly because he was too familiar with the image of the Saint Soul. These summoned creatures formed from fragments of history. Brando couldn't even describe their state of existence. Rather than heroic spirits, they were more like the manifestation of a law. But clearly, these things that Ovinus summoned were not here to have a tea party with him. The girl of lightning pointed her spear downwards. Her deep, penetrating voice almost drowned out the rumbling of the collapsing hull. Heroes are merely beings bound by fate and wishes. Their goal is to ensure that the fate of the world continues to exist along a predetermined line. Human, accept their challenge. More than 10 projections of heroes that seemed to have walked out of legends rushed towards Brando. Brando's face was pale with fright. Although he didn't know how much power these summoned creatures had, if they were too weak, Ovina probably wouldn't have let them out. The elemental power of fate was a bug. Brando immediately revised the order of the elemental power in his mind. In the past, there had been quite a few players who had the gift of fate in the game. But he didn't expect this elemental power to be so freakish when it reached the realm of the power of existence. It was as if he could get anything he wanted. The first to reach him was Saint Soul's illusion. He didn't know if it was a coincidence, but the Wind Empress had clearly demonstrated the power she should have. Brando was just about to raise his sword to parry the elf's attack when Saint Soul stepped back and a series of illusions appeared in front of him. 9 Luminaries Sword Art. Brando immediately realized that his 9 Luminaries Sword Art was nothing compared to the real Saint Soul. First of all, their magical powers weren't on the same level. The Wind Empress in front of him seemed to be able to continuously cast 9 Luminaries Sword Art. And each illusion lasted for a very long time, making it difficult to distinguish between the real and the fake. And that wasn't the end of it. Next to him was the Flame King, Gretel, who was ready to attack at any moment. Brando's Flash Strike Sword Art had left a deep impression on him. But luckily, Brando still had one last trick up his sleeve. The hull was disappearing beneath everyone's feet. He took a step back and grabbed the ponytailed girl's arm. Scarlet paused and instinctively pulled back her hand. "My lord. We can't win. Let's run." Brando answered. He never had the self-awareness of being an expert. He raised his head and took one last look at Ovina, who was at the very top. More and more heroes were emerging from the screen of light behind her. It made his scalp go numb. There was no way to win. He didn't know which idiotic designer had designed such a scene. What made him even angrier was that this design actually existed in this world as well. Was there any scientific basis for this? Brando shook his head and shouted in the direction where William had been, "Master William, we'll be going first." With that, he immediately grabbed Scarlet's hand and jumped into the darkness below. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 677. Brando swore that if he had known what it felt like to be buried under sand, he would have surrendered rather than run away. At first, he felt his body falling rapidly in the darkness. Countless objects fell around him, accompanied by the sound of the wind. There was only a faint light above his head, which should be the direction of the collapsing underground hole. About a second or two later, he felt a violent impact. A normal person would have been smashed to pieces under such an impact, but it was nothing to a peak gold-tier physical strength. Brando only felt that he had hit a slope, and then rolled down along the sharp rocks. He tried to grab onto something, but it was futile in the darkness. A large amount of sand rolled him down until he hit a flat rock. Brando felt the first impact, and then the second impact was a soft body hitting him. He immediately realized that it was Scarlet. More rocks and sand were falling from above. Brando hurriedly pulled the girl down, and then turned around to block in front of her. In just a split second, there was a loud rumble as several huge rocks smashed heavily onto his body. Of course, this was nothing to Brando. It felt like he was hit by a few sticks, but the large amount of sand made him suffer. He coughed, and his mouth was full of sand. But this was not the most tragic experience. The key point was that when he lowered his head and subconsciously wanted to spit out the sand in his mouth, he met a pair of bright eyes. It was a pair of quiet, curious, and shy eyes. Obviously, it belonged to a mountain girl who liked to keep her hair in a long ponytail. Scarlet was under Brando's protection, and she obediently looked at her lord without moving. For both Brando and Scarlet, it was not difficult to see in the dark. Both of them could clearly see each other's state. But fortunately, it was not the first time they had encountered such a situation. The last time they were chased by the misty nightmare in the loop of trade winds, they had experienced almost the same situation. After the first experience, at least the second time was not as awkward. "My lord," Scarlet whispered and blinked, "thank you." Woo-woo. Brando's mouth was full of sand, and he was unable to speak. His face was almost touching Scarlet's. He couldn't spit sand on her face, could he? Rumbling sounds were still coming from outside. It was clear that the collapse would not end anytime soon. But Brando did not answer, and the mountain girl looked at him carefully. After a while, Brando suddenly felt Scarlet move, and then gently leaned her forehead against his chest. This seemingly unintentional action made Brando's heart skip a beat. He subconsciously lowered his head and saw Scarlet curled up in his arms like a child. "Wah. Chien. I'm sorry." Scarlet seemed to have been awakened by his voice. She was startled and quickly let go of his hand.
Brando looked at her carefully, shrinking back, and couldn't help but feel sorry for her. "Actually, it's okay. Are you scared?" Scarlet frowned and shook her head slightly. Brando was silent for a moment. To be honest, he could not tell what this girl was thinking. Since the Battle of Ampere Seal, Makarov had come to see her a few times, but she had rejected him. Scarlet was usually quiet and only occasionally accompanied the Roman, but according to the other members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, she was not like this in the past. He thought for a moment and felt that he was not suited to guess a girl's thoughts. After all, he was a complete loser when it came to that in his last life. He shook his head and decided to change the topic. "Scarlet, how did you break through Ovina's element?" The mountain girl paused and looked up at him curiously. "You don't know?" Brando was stunned. Of course, he could see that Scarlet's expression was genuine. Scarlet shook her head in confusion. "That's strange." Brando was even more confused than Scarlet. He knew the power of Ovina's element of fate. Ovina's element of fate was similar to a speech spirit, but it was much more powerful. If you could not break through your own fate, then you would never be able to defeat her. You might not even be able to attack her. But the problem was, as a gold-level being, it was an impossible task to break free from the element of a legendary hero who had mastered the power of existence. Even the Silver Storm, Master William, would not be able to do it, much less him or Scarlet. Could it be because of the dragon bloodline? But he had never heard of a gold person being able to challenge someone of a higher level. It could only be said that they were more talented. Brando frowned and couldn't figure it out. But at that moment, he suddenly felt something. He looked up and realized that the sound of the falling rocks had quieted down. This was undoubtedly the best news for him at the moment. He hurriedly threw away the messy thoughts in his mind. He stretched out his hand and easily lifted the rock that was pressing down on him. With another push, the gravel rolled down into the darkness along with the sand and sand. Brando climbed out of the rubble in no time and then rescued Scarlet from the rubble. The two of them finally reached a flat rock. They looked around and realized that the collapsed hall had formed a giant hole. They were in the middle of this hole. Above their heads, any signs of human activity had long disappeared. Brando looked around. In theory, when the hall collapsed, besides him and Scarlet, William and Ovina should have been caught in the mud and sand. The others were bound to the wall by the lightning cage and shouldn't have been in too much danger. But Brendel strained his eyes to find William and Ovina's silhouettes in the darkness, but he couldn't find any of them. That's strange. He paused slightly. According to Ovina and William's powers, they should have been able to escape earlier than he was. The collapse from before looked dangerous, but for beings of their level, it shouldn't have been much trouble at all. My lord, look over there. Scarlet stood beside Brando without saying a word after being dragged out of the rubble. But as a half-dragon, her eyesight was obviously much better than Brando's. Brando looked in the direction she pointed. After a while, he saw a dot of light flying out of the darkness. But when the light came closer, he realized that it wasn't a dot of light at all. It was William flying in midair, holding a glowing staff in his hand. And when he got closer, Brando suddenly saw that the old magician was carrying a person in his hand, from the platinum body made of lightning. Who else could it be but Ovina? William's flying spell was extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, he was right in front of Brando. He descended, his long robe fluttering in the air, and then landed firmly in front of Brando. He reached out and threw Ovina in front of Brendel. She's unconscious. Brendel's jaw dropped as he stared at Ovina, whose eyes were tightly shut. He couldn't believe that this was the mighty Lord Heroic Spirit from before. Normally, as long as one's body was complete, even if one fell from a height of several thousand feet, one shouldn't have fainted. This was too degrading. You guessed right, little one. After leaving that hall, her power weakened rapidly, the old magician replied. When I found her, she was at most an upper silver level. And her magic was still draining away. I can foresee that if this continues, she won't even be able to maintain her original form. I see. Brando paused, but then he felt a little troubled. He couldn't help but look at the lightning girl on the ground and say, so what's the situation now? Did we win or lose? This girl isn't going to go back on her word, is she? Ahem. What do you take me for? Brando had just finished speaking when the unconscious Ovina on the ground suddenly woke up. Although she still looked a little weak, she still glared at Brando and said, although I hate opportunistic people the most, a win is a win. I won't deny it. The girl panted, and then her face became much rosier. Brando and William both frowned slightly, because at the same time, they realized that Ovina's power seemed to have increased. You can still recover your power? Brando couldn't help but ask, wasn't that hall destroyed? Wait, you. He narrowed his eyes, as if he realized something. But the silver magician leader was one step ahead of him, and a look of realization appeared on his face. Humph, at least you have some smarts, Ovina snapped. Ovina replied in annoyance, it's just as you guessed. My power doesn't increase the closer I get to the hall. Instead, the closer I got to the Holy Lance of Heaven, the closer my power was to its peak.
I'm sure you've guessed it, I'm not some azure knight, I'm the heaven. Ha! Brando felt as if he had been punched in the face. So you're saying that everything that happened before was a self-directed act? Not entirely. As a divine artifact, of course I have the right to choose my owner. Ovina lifted her chin and answered proudly. Alright, that has nothing to do with us anyway. Brando shrugged. It wasn't the first time he had seen a magical equipment with a soul. The ring of the Wind Empress on his hand had a heroic spirit sealed in it during the War of the Holy Saints, not to mention that many famous magical equipment in the Amber Sword had similar mechanisms. However, it was the first time he had seen a heroic spirit sealed in a ring that was so powerful. But the more it was like this, the more it proved the value of the heaven. He thought for a moment and continued, "No matter what, you admit that we won before, right? So now you can choose who your owner will be, right?" "Yes," Ovina answered through gritted teeth. "But before that, I have a question." I want to know how she was able to pierce through my elemental power." The girl in lightning form looked at Scarlet on the side, her face once again filled with disbelief. Like Brando, she couldn't figure out how a gold rank could ignore the influence of her elemental power of fate. Brando glanced at Scarlet and thought for a moment. Maybe it's because of her dragon bloodline. Impossible. Ovina denied without hesitation. She's just a gold person. Since when did their bloodline have such power? Unless some genetic mutation happened in the past 10,000 years, but the chances of that are too small. Genetic mutation. Brando chewed on this word by word. Did the Amber Sword have such a setting? But the girl in lightning form only snorted coldly and didn't answer him. The darkness seemed to fall silent again until the Archmage William thought for a moment and said, "Maybe I know why." Everyone turned to look at him. In our history, there are some things that can allow people to change their fate and break free from the shackles of fate. The Archmage answered slowly. "Brando, you know that little girl Alaz, right?" "Ah!" Brendel suddenly exclaimed with a look of sudden realization. "So that's how it is, I got it. P.S. The mighty baboon is at it again." Please don't mind the wrong title of the second chapter. Anyone who cares about details is an idiot. Keep following me on Weibo. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 678. So, what's going on? Ovina asked with a frown, still half kneeling on the ground. She rubbed her arm with one hand and frowned. The girl's energy body looked like it was made of platinum. The white irises in her eyes were like translucent rings. Only when they contracted slightly could one guess what she was thinking. She was obviously very angry right now. The reason is actually very simple. Brando grinned. His voice echoed in the darkness with a hint of playfulness. He suddenly raised his hand and placed it behind Scarlet, pushing the girl who had been standing in the shadows with her head lowered in front of him. "Lady Ovina, you must have heard of the legend of the fairy's golden apple, right?" Scarlet seemed a little nervous. She turned to look at her lord in surprise. But Brando shook his head at her, indicating that she need not be nervous. He did this in hopes that Scarlet would leave a deeper impression on Ovina, because Ovina would definitely choose the successor of the Holy Lance of Heaven from the three of them. He himself was more accomplished in swordsmanship, and William's identity and profession were not suitable to be the successor of the Azure Lance. Therefore, he hoped that Ovina would choose Scarlet as the successor of the Azure Lance. Most importantly, he hoped to give Scarlet courage and confidence, so that this Highlander girl would understand that no one's existence in this world had to rely on others. He hoped that Scarlet would have her own thoughts and destiny, to pursue her own dreams. A Scarlet who would always stand behind him, like a silent shadow. This Scarlet made his heart soften. But it was also because of this that he hoped the girl would understand that there was no such thing as a lowly background in this world. A girl from the countryside of Butchie could also become the hope and protector of many people in a certain era. Only confidence and hard work were the driving forces of every individual's progress in civilization and order. Ovina took a closer look at Scarlet. Her pupils were like burning platinum flames, and her eyebrows were like extended flames. She frowned slightly. Is this the reality of longing? She closed her eyes and sniffed. So that's how it is. She does have the unique scent of the fairies. The residents of Valenia's home of the fairies have been researching ways to change fate for a long time. I didn't expect them to succeed, but it's only breaking the laws. It's still useless to advance in chaos. I was too careless. Then she opened her eyes again. She looked at Scarlet and then at Brando. I heard her call you Lord. Is she your subordinate? Oh no. Brando thought Ovina was going to hold a grudge against him and hurriedly explained, I guess you could say that. Barely. Ovina stared at Brando suspiciously and dragged out her words. Brando pondered for a moment and quickly organized his words. It's probably because I helped Scarlet when she was in trouble, so nominally, Scarlet is now by my side as my guard. Of course, you can also think that I'm forcing her to return the favor, but no matter what, the contract between us will continue until she feels that she has repaid the favor, Lord. Scarlet turned around and called out softly. Brando's self-deprecation obviously made her nervous. Brando hurriedly gave her a look. Ovina looked at the two of them with slight disdain. How clumsy. But I didn't know you had some kindness in you. But don't you think it's a bit inappropriate for me to acknowledge her? It's not just that she's weak, because that's not the point. The point is that she doesn't have the heart to become strong. Without confidence, she can't look at herself. How can she realize her beliefs? Maybe she's even confused about her beliefs. The azure lance in her hands will only bury me. She stared at Scarlet, who lowered her head in silence. Then Ovina turned around and looked at Brando with some admiration. You, on the other hand, although you're still weak, you already have some potential. That's true. Otherwise, that guy wouldn't have chosen you, right? Haven't you noticed that you have a temperament that doesn't fit in with this world? And it's because of this temperament that you have the possibility of changing history. What do you think? Do you want to consider making a pact with me and becoming the new master of the Azure Lance, human? Brando was slightly taken aback. He didn't expect Ovina to acknowledge him. But he sighed and shook his head. You're wrong, Lady Ovina. No one is born strong, and no one is born to change the world. But at every moment, everyone will change themselves for some reason. As long as there's something important in your heart that needs to be protected, anyone can become strong. In this world, strength and weakness have never been a constant factor. I've seen Scarlet's anger over her dead companions. It's because of that anger that I believe she can do it. Scarlet, raise your head. You've defeated Lady Ovina, so you also have the right to be acknowledged by the Azure Lance. Brando ordered firmly and sternly. Scarlet trembled. She bit her lip and raised her head to look at Brando. She knew that it was the Azure Lance, the most dazzling existence in the legends. Her Highness the Princess, His Lordship, and even Count Yenbao. There were many people here who were more qualified than her to pick up the holy lance that had once shattered the Azure Lance. Her Highness the Princess was brave, His Lordship was righteous, and Miss Dilfery was determined and full of ideals. Everyone here seemed to be better than her. The Azure Lance could belong to any one of them, but how could it belong to her? But even so, there was still a trace of indescribable gratitude in the depths of her eyes. That gratitude was because she was touched by the acknowledgement. The darkness was controlled by solitude for a moment, and it silently spread out. William stood beside the three of them. Under his silver eyebrows, his wise eyes revealed a look of interest. It was as if it had nothing to do with him. He only occasionally used his fingers to sweep the dust off his long sleeves. As a wizard, he had no interest in the ownership of the Azure Lance to begin with. Ovina couldn't help but groan. She was probably grumbling about the fact that she had been defeated by a little girl like this. She couldn't help but look at Brando with some annoyance. You really want her to pick up the Azure Lance? Can't she? There are many others in the Great Hall. They are even more suitable than her. That half-elf girl, she is calm and collected. And that little woman dressed like a merchant who came with you, she has a noble bloodline. There are a few others. Although they aren't as good as these two, at least they are much better than her. Ovina frowned. I really don't understand your thinking. I know that, but I still think Scarlet is better. You. The girl of lightning stammered. Why? Because she is ordinary. That's why she can turn from a cocoon into something magical. In a time in the past, the Knight of the Azure Lance once used the Holy Lance to shatter the Azure Lance, causing the stars to fall to the ground. In the end, it brought about the Age of Mortals. Lady Ovina, in Kurlut's history, the Azure Lance represents an endless struggle. Even the lowliest of existences can stand at the pinnacle of glory. Because of this, the Age of Mortals is filled with color. Brando answered slowly. Ovina was speechless for a moment. She glared at Brando. The sound of clapping finally rang out. William clapped his hands lightly and answered, "Well said. The age of silver and gold has long passed. Mortals have to control their own destinies. Lady Ovina, honestly speaking, none of us here have the right to inherit the Azure Lance. But in comparison, sometimes a coincidence might be Martha's will." All right, I understand. Ovina sighed and stood up from the ground. She looked at Scarlet and extended her hand. You are very lucky, little girl. Come, extend your hand. Let me see what you are thinking. Scarlet hesitated for a moment and turned to look at Brando. But Brando only nodded slightly at her. Okay. The Highlander girl seemed to have finally gathered all her courage. She bit her lip, then extended her hand and placed it in Ovina's palm. Ovina closed her eyes and her sword-like brows finally relaxed. For the first time, a peaceful expression appeared on her face. So this is your past. It is better than I imagined. But it is only a temporary setback. It is not an excuse for people to be weak. The Azure Lance is a sharp blade that protects the mortal world. Scarlet, the shattering of the heavens and the falling of stars.
This is the history of mortals conquering their destinies. Can you feel the courage contained in all this? Yes, you want to protect? Ovina suddenly asked. Then there was a short silence. Scarlet did not answer. But after a while, Ovina suddenly opened her eyes. She turned to look at Brando in confusion. The strange meaning in those platinum eyes made even Brando pause. But when he looked again, Ovina had closed her eyes again. Open your heart and accept me, Scarlet, Ovina chanted. From this day onwards, until the final day comes, Scarlet repeated. The contract is established. A pillar of white light and a green halo spread out from the darkness. Like an invisible wind, it lifted the Highlander girl's long hair. Scarlet suddenly screamed, because she saw Ovina turn into the purest white light in front of her and merge into her chest. Everyone saw this scene. Out of all of them, only Makarov, who was bound to the wall by lightning, had the most complicated expression. He probably could not understand why Brendel would give up the opportunity to sign a contract with the Azure Lance, and give this unprecedented divine weapon to his adopted daughter who was not particularly outstanding. The princess frowned slightly, but quickly understood. Dilfari was curious. Among everyone, the only one she liked was the merchant girl, who was bound tightly by lightning. It wasn't that Ovina was giving her special treatment. It was just that the merchant girl was too dishonest. Plus, the Witch Queen's inheritance in her bag was not to be underestimated. But even so, Roman said happily to the white mist on his shoulder, I knew Scarlet would be the most suitable. Last night I even made a bet with Brando. Because among us, only Scarlet uses a gun, right? That, me, is so stubborn, unlike me who guessed the result right away. Scarlet and that gun are so compatible, so beautiful. When I have time, I must borrow it from her and play with it. White Mist yawned. She was too lazy to answer her, and too lazy to remind the merchant girl that Medisha also used a gun. Even though Medisha was a heroic spirit, Roman probably didn't think that far ahead. On the other side, in the darkness, after the seemingly endless light dissipated, Ovina had turned into thousands of lightning bolts. The platinum lightning gathered into a bundle in Scarlet's hand. When the light faded, all that was left was a shining spear. Upon closer inspection, it was the holy lance of heaven. Scarlet stared blankly at the pale green holy spear that was like jade. She couldn't react in time. Lady. Ovina. The holy lance in her hand buzzed. This is her. Brando walked forward and stared closely at the legendary holy lance. Ovina is the will of the holy lance. But your power is still too weak, so I'm afraid you won't be able to sense her presence for the time being. As he spoke, he lifted his head.
Without Ovina's power restraining them, the lightning cages in the hall dissipated. The remaining magic brought everyone down slowly, landing not far from Brando and the others. The merchant girl, who was the first to land, immediately shouted in surprise, "Brando!" Then she hurried over. "My lord! Brando! Mr. Brando!" After that, Medisha, the Shire, Freya, and Princess Griffin all gathered around the three of them. Of course, without exception, everyone's eyes fell on the holy lance of heaven in Scarlet's hand. This was the weapon that pierced through the heavens in the ancient legends. The Roman couldn't help but blink and asked curiously, "Brando, is this lance really as powerful as the legends say? Is this lance really as powerful as the legends say?" This was undoubtedly the question in everyone's mind, including Brando. He thought for a moment, then walked forward and placed his hand on the blade of the holy lance of heaven in Scarlet's hand. Scarlet paused and looked up at him in confusion. "My lord." Brando didn't answer immediately. He had already seen a pale green screen of light extend from the tip of the lance. Holy Lance, Divine Weapon, Attack, 112-147 plus 45 Strength, plus 45 Dexterity, plus 45 Vitality, plus 45 Bloodline, plus 45 Senses. Additional skills. Fate, a legend that has accumulated over time on the spear. It is like an eternal fate that curses its enemies. Any target hit by the Holy Lance will continuously bleed from the wound due to the curse, dealing 11 points of damage per second. This damage can be stacked repeatedly. Holy Lance, pure wind elements surround the blade of the lance. The wielder can summon the power of lightning. Every time the wielder attacks, they can copy the power of lightning to deal the same amount of damage to enemies in any direction. The amount of lightning depends on the magic of the wielder. Divine Weapon Domain. Undefeatable Fate, an invisible force protects the Holy Lance. Any attack that is lower in power than the wielder will be weakened by 90%. The ability to change fate is immune to this effect. Brando narrowed his eyes slightly when he saw these rows of attributes. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.